Lord of Mysteries. Fire of Destruction Chapter 321 to 330. Thursday, August 16, 1349. 1 hour to noon. Empress Borough. Earl Hall Villa. In her room and looking out the window at the clear sky. Audrey Hall had her brow slightly furrowed and her hands on her chest, worry evident on her face. It's been 2 days already. Audrey thought as she let out her 10th sigh of the morning. It had been 2 days since Mr. Chariot had been kidnapped. As soon as she had found out, she had thought about praying to Mr. Fool to find out about the man's situation, but at the last moment, she stopped herself. Mr. Fool is still dealing with the ritual of the true creator along with his blessed one. I can't bother him now. Audrey reminded herself every time she felt like praying to the mysterious entity who was probably an elder god. She also thought about invoking the man's messenger but also held back on doing so. If he is in an uncomfortable or delicate situation, then receiving his messenger would only put him in a more dangerous situation. It could alert an enemy or his location could be discovered. Letting out another sigh, Audrey sat back in her desk chair and leaning her arm against the imported Fasak wood, she sank her head into it. I joined a secret organization and even participated in its first mission, but when one of our members is in mortal danger, I can't do anything. Not being able to do anything to help was eating her up inside. Looking up and staring at nothing, she sighed again. I hope Mr. Chariot is all right. The man might be a bully and would always pick on her at every opportunity he could find, and she might not like his know-it-all attitude, but that didn't mean she wanted anything to happen to him. A sudden weight on her left leg snapped her out of her thoughts. Looking to her side, a sweet smile was born on her lips. With big worried eyes, Susie was looking at him as he rested against her leg. Are you okay? Do you want to play ball to calm down? The dog asked, failing to control her wagging tail as she thought of her second favorite toy. The first was the huge bone that was hidden under Audrey's bed. Nodding slightly and letting out a small chuckle at the last request, the human spectator's gloved hand reached down and nuzzled behind her friend's ear. I'm fine, Susie. Just a little tired. When her pet had first spoken a few days ago, it had no doubt come as a shock, but thanks to Chariot warning her about it, didn't affect her as much as it would have otherwise. The spectator dog looked deeply at his master and friend for a few long seconds. Audrey noticed how the dog was trying to read whether she was telling the truth or not. At the deep stare of her furry friend, Audrey felt her eyebrow twitch. Knock knock. Miss Audrey. Your bath has been prepared. The voice of her maid, Annie, sounded behind the door. Just in time. Audrey thought, happy to be saved from her dog's scrutiny, but kept her joy hidden lest Susie discover her. With her green eyes, she gave a message to Susie, who only nodded and lay down at her feet and closed her eyes. Returning her attention to the door, she answered as she rose from her chair. Coming, Annie. Sherwood Borough. House of Zeo and Furs. Are you sure you're feeling all right, Furs? The shorter woman asked her friend with an eyebrow raised in surprise. Wearing a white shirt along with a black vest and boots, with her triangular sword resting on her hip, and from the light sweat on her forehead, it was obvious the woman had just returned from a job and was having a hard time giving feet and heads to what she was seeing. All right. Quote. A smoldering gaze that lent a passionate air to the usual sluggishness the writer conveyed. Slightly yellowed fingers didn't stop writing at any point. Black ink smudges on her cheeks and slight dark circles under her eyes adorned her sloppy, tired appearance, but she didn't look exhausted in the least. Green eyes shifted slightly to the lady's side. A large stack of completed pages rested to the right of the desk, making a decent mountain. Turning back to the writer, Zeo took a few seconds to recover from the incredible and miraculous sight. Are you sure? Nodding energetically, Furs finished the page she was writing and placed the sheet on the mountain of papers as she began to write on a new one, at no time looking up from the current page and showing great skill with her hands. It's been a long time since I've felt such inspiration. I have to write this before it goes by. Furs exclaimed without looking up as a big smile grew on her face. Oh ho ho. This book will make me a lot of money. I'm a genius. With blue eyes shining with determination, her hand sped up. This new novel will be one of romance and mystery. A rookie detective trying to catch a supposed vigilante who massacres gangs in a game of cat and mouse. But the detective would be the mouse. The vigilante would actually be her sidekick who enjoys toying with her with both identities. Explaining what her new book would consist of, the enlightened writer looked at her partner with blue eyes sparkling with excitement. Hey, this will sell just like beer in a Fasak bar. Furs laughed darkly. Seeing her friend's state, Zio kept a flat expression. Her gaze strayed for a moment to the bed, which as usual was messy, but the mess was less than what Furs usually left when she woke up. An idea popped into her mind and Zio swallowed her annoyance and returned her attention to the writer. Quote. Since what time do you not sleep? What time is it? 11:15 in the morning. Since 9 o'clock. Furs replied energetically as she finished the page and turned to write another. Knowing she wasn't going to like knowing whether he meant 9 p.m. or 9 a.m., and neither which she would prefer it to be, Zio just sighed and unbuttoned her shirt sleeves. Ads by PubFuture. I'll go prepare a snack. Anything you want specifically. Coffee. Lots of coffee. Without looking her way, Furs pointed a finger of her free hand as she continued typing. Of course. Rolling her eyes, Zio turned around in the direction of the kitchen, not before leaving her sword hanging on the coat rack. It seems her day off would start earlier. As she walked down the stairs towards the kitchen, Zio couldn't help but let out a small laugh as she remembered her friend's dirty face. How long had it been since she had seen her so focused on something? Halfway up the stairs, Zio's foot stopped as she thought about the premise of Fur's new book and couldn't help but feel a great familiarity with it, as if she had already heard it somewhere. Her brow furrowed slightly, as if she suddenly realized something in her friend's words. She stood still for a few seconds, slowly replaying the writer's words in her mind, trying to find the source of that annoyance. Female detective whose assistant is actually the culprit she's been looking for and who enjoys bothering her in both identities. Rookie detective, guilty assistant who keeps pestering her. And is actually the culprit. Single quote. Single quote. Single quote. Exclamation mark. Single quote. That woman. A vein began to throb wildly in Zio's forehead and she was about to go back to Furs and burn those pages. She had based the book on her relationship with Adrian Kenway. She was the rookie detective while the redhead was her annoying assistant who annoyed her every chance he got. If she wasn't so annoyed with her, she would be impressed that she seemed to have overcome her fear of the man by daring to write a story based on him. But the idea of it being that seemed impossible to her. Surely she didn't even realize that. The mere mention of his name makes her tremble worse than grilled fish. Turning around, Zio was about to give a piece of her mind to her friend before stopping herself. Letting out a heavy sigh, she brought a hand to her face. 2 days since her partner had been kidnapped. It would be a lie to say she didn't fear for his safety. She had tried not to think about it too much, but now her mind kept returning to the subject. I can't believe I'm worried about that idiot. Shaking her head, Zio continued on her way to the kitchen. Now she could only hope that idiot didn't do something stupid and he could return safely. Harvest Church. Moving from place to place, a young man had his eyes closed, hands clasped in front of his mouth in prayer. Between his hands, one could see various charms of various shapes and colors, but the most prominent was gold. Please, Scarlet Monarch, protect us in our time of trouble. Please, Scarlet Monarch, protect the boss and bring him back safe and sound. Please, Scarlet Monarch, protect us in our time of trouble. Repeating the prayer for the 15th time in the last 5 minutes, the anxiety and nervousness were clear in Charlotte. Sitting in the kitchen chair and eating an oatmeal cookie, Jerry looked with a slightly raised eyebrow at the man in front of her. Her gray eyes moved to the giantess sitting next to her with clear doubt in them. Hee. Bringing a calloused hand to her head, Sasha gave an uncomfortable laugh. A friend of yours, Miss Sasha? Opera asked in a gentle voice as she poured tea into 4 simple cups and after doing so sat down next to them, her eyes straying to the only man in the room. Curiosity shone in them. Since yesterday the giantess had been bringing that young man to the church. His name was Charlotte, a curious name for a man, and so far he preferred to keep to himself, so they had barely had any interaction with him. For his part, Father Utravsky simply said that as long as he didn't disturb the others and behaved himself, he could hang out in the kitchen. Grabbing the cup and taking a sip, feeling the mild chamomile flavor, Sasha let out a satisfied sigh. Thanking the black-haired woman for the tea, the giantess looked at her teammate and after thinking for 2 seconds nodded. You could say that. It's someone I've been training in my spare time. Delicate black eyebrows rose in surprise and Opera nodded, looking back at the young man who kept moving from side to side and noticing that he was somewhat thin. She nodded impressed. I'm surprised he's still in one piece. She muttered under her breath. Hey, what do you mean by that? I'm very gentle, Sasha thought with her eyebrow twitching. She knew how to control her strength, thank you very much. The one who wasn't gentle was the boss. He always left them with their bodies crying from the pain after a spar. And she didn't even want to remember the mysticism classes he gave. Just thinking about it made her body tremble. Not even the training she went through when she was still in the church was so brutal. Jerry simply watched the man with crystalline eyes as her small hands carefully held the cup of tea, her cookies resting on a plate beside her. After a few seconds of silence, she spoke in a voice loud enough for the two women to hear but low enough for the man not to. If he trains with you, that means he knows about Mr. Kenway, right? Sasha's expression froze, mouth slightly hanging open, and orange blonde eyebrows touching her hair. The giantess looked wordlessly at the little girl. Giving the older woman a small smile, Jerry closed her eyes and took a small sip from her cup. I guessed as much. Spectators. They really are scary. The boss had given them all the information they needed about the little girl, especially her being a half-spectator. Even in her time in the Church of the God of Combat, she had never had any encounter with the Beyonders of that path. If a little girl who was not even a true spectator was so scary, how terrifying were the high sequences of that path? Ads by PubFuture. Opening and closing her mouth but no words coming out. Sasha let out an exasperated sigh and ruffled the girl's hair. You're too smart for your own good, you know. With closed eyes, Jerry nodded with a satisfied smile. Green eyes moved to the black-haired girl who was also quietly enjoying her tea. You don't look surprised, Opera. Did you know that too? A small blush adorned the cheeks of the red-eyed woman who nodded. Hee. Forgive me if I offend you, Miss Sasha, but it was too obvious. He is nothing like the Mr. Nathan you describe so much, and you don't strike me as the type to be unfaithful to your partner either. Pursing her lips, Sasha felt disappointed with herself for failing to hide Charlotte's relationship with them, but in the end just sighed again. Why did the boss have to meet people as sharp as you? She complained, earning a satisfied smile from the two women. Gray eyes returned their attention to the only man in the room for a few seconds before returning to Sasha. What's got you two so nervous? You can hide it well, Miss Sasha, but I can see you are just as scared as Mr. Charlotte. Even Father Yutravsky looks more tense than usual. Biting the inside of her cheek, Sasha again cursed that Jerry was so smart. Her eyes moved to the Malay scholar who heard the question and was looking at her with purple eyes glowing anxiously. Charlotte slowly shook his head, unsure if telling the reason was a good idea or not. But just at that moment, Kryak, it's fine. It doesn't matter if you don't tell them now, they'll end up finding out later. The mountain of a man that was father entered the kitchen with the squeak of the door, although I highly recommend telling them. On his back was the huge blanket with the handle protruding from his right shoulder, and in his right hand he was carrying another similar object wrapped in blankets but smaller. A golden handle protruded from the blanket. Father Yutravsky. What's going on? Opera asked uncertainly as the older man approached the table with long and surprisingly not very heavy steps. It's best if young Sasha explains it to you. With that said, and leaving the responsibility of delivering the news to the smaller giantess, Father Yutravsky extended the object in his hand to Sasha. You will need this. Unsure, Sasha grasped the object by the protruding part, but as soon as her fingers touched the golden handle, a warm sensation enveloped her body and she felt lighter and cleaner. Realization hit her and she let go of the handle for a second. A sealed artifact. Her eyebrows rose to touch her hair and her hands trembled slightly. With a look full of questions, she was going to question Father Yutravsky, but he just shook his head. Consider it a gift for your stay here. Turning and focusing his attention on Opera, he continued, when young Sasha fills you in on what is going on, I want you with me in the hall. His eyes moved to Charlotte and the young man straightened under the heavy pressure of the man's gaze. Same to you, Mr. Charlotte. Straightening up even more, Charlotte nodded sharply at the words of the man who had more pressure than his boss. Yes, sir. Nodding calmly at the young man's words, Father Yutravsky finally left the kitchen. Listening as father's footsteps made their way to the hall, Opera and Jerry turned to Sasha with expressions full of concern and fear. Miss Sasha, what's going on? The red-eyed woman was the first to ask, and Jerry nodded at her words. Swallowing saliva, Sasha let out a heavy sigh. Carefully placing Father Yutravsky's gift at her side but keeping her hand off the handle, she looked at the frightened woman with a serious, dark expression. Shortly after, the boss was kidnapped. Saying the last cost her more than she intended, but after a moment she continued, "Yesterday we received a message from him." Immediately Opera and Jerry jumped at the mention that the redhead had contacted Sasha. "Is Adrian all right? How is Mr. Kenway? Did he tell you when he'll be back? What happened to him? Has he been eating well? Is he sick? Hurt?" Clicking her tongue inwardly, Sasha raised her free hand to silence the women, who after a few more questions finally calmed down. "Right now we don't know about the boss's condition. He was in a big hurry, so all he could do was send a message," Sasha calmly explained to the woman and little girl in front of her, while making sure to keep her expression, body language, and emotions in place. "While he was rescuing you," she said as she looked at Jerry, "the boss discovered something horrible. The monsters that kidnapped you, along with the major gangs of East Borough, all of them had kidnapped over 78,000 people. They are all being handed over to a secret organization." At the mention of the number, the women blanched and even Jerry snapped out of her spectator state, but Sasha just continued. "The boss reported this to the 3 churches so they would investigate. According to his theory, he believed that most likely these people would be or were used for a ritual to an evil god. We don't know how, because the boss didn't have time to explain it, but he told us that something related to those disappearances would happen today. He asked me to bring Charlotte with me in case a disaster occurred and I could protect him. Due to the Scarlet Monarch's order that they could not spread his name, she, along with Charlotte and with Hazel's help, had created a lie to warn Father Utravsky about what would happen today. While the Scarlet Monarch had only said that something would happen today. The boss had told them all about the kidnappings and gangs when he rescued Jerry. One didn't have to be smart to relate what would happen today to the kidnappings. They agreed among themselves that it would be best for the father to be aware of what might or might not happen. But from the man's lack of reaction to the information, it was clear that he was aware to some extent of what might happen. At least that made it easier for him to swallow the lie without giving it much thought. Without Hazel, this would have been harder. Now that she's a swindler, her ability to lie is on another level. Even a half-spectator like Jerry would be unable to see the lie. As long as I control my expression, there will be no suspicion, Sasha thought as she looked at the women in front of her who had downcast looks and dark expressions. Letting out a sigh, Sasha looked at Charlotte, who was checking her charms for the who knows what time, and squeezed the handle in her hand. "I wonder how Hazel is." Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Tap 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 tap. The walk down the short aisle of the small church felt much longer than it was, the air exceedingly heavy and asphyxiating. The father's gift hung over her left shoulder. Charlotte walked beside her, the charms in his hands clenched tightly. Looking over her shoulder, Sasha took in the expressions of her colleagues. Opera was trying to keep a calm mask, but the slight tremor in her hands showed her nervousness. Jerry was hiding it a little better, but the slight trembling of her lips showed that she was scared too. Letting out a small soundless sigh, Sasha returned her attention to the front. She didn't break the awkward silence, for she didn't know what to say. What was one supposed to say after warning that in half an hour something might happen and that she had no information on how bad it would be? She didn't try to lie that it would be something horrible, as she would be found out immediately by the little girl behind her, so she just decided to keep it as simple as the Scarlet Monarch had explained it according to Charlotte. Honestly, that terrified Sasha even more. If a mysterious existence like he goes out of his way to give a warning, what will happen today? Sasha felt her stomach empty despite having eaten something just a few minutes ago. It couldn't be anything good. Before she could continue her thoughts, she felt a small trembling hand gently grasp hers. Looking down, crystal clear eyes that despite being frightened she could see the concern in them. "Are you all right, Miss Sasha?" Big gray eyes, freckles running from cheek to cheek, short curly brown hair and a scar from her forehead running down to her right eyebrow, and with a slight frown, Sasha couldn't help but smile. Jerry was such a tender child. Squeezing her hand lightly, being careful not to use too much force, Sasha nodded less tensely. "I can say I've been better, but I'll survive." Saying she was fine would be a lie, one that Jerry would easily see through and make her more nervous, so she decided to be honest. The small nod from the little girl showed that she appreciated the honesty. She held the giant's hand and walked beside her. The only man in the small group just gave a small glance and let out a heavy sigh. Opera looked at this with a gentle smile. She swallowed a little saliva, feeling her throat dry. Evil gods, rituals, secret organizations. Honestly, she thought she would find it a little hard to believe that these divine beings were real, but to her surprise she wasn't that surprised. Perhaps having seen supernatural powers firsthand during her time in Deadshot and Adrian's shadow abilities had made such a thing not seem as crazy to her as before, and thus much easier to accept. And Adrian is fighting all that by himself. He's a real hero. Opera praised in her heart and felt calmer. If the redhead was taking care of the problem, then she had nothing to fear. Tap 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 tap. Finally arriving at the hall, those present looked in surprise at the imposing figure of the father sitting on one of the benches. The classic brown tunic was gone, taking its place a simple white shirt and over it a kind of shoulder pad and breastplate that covered his upper abdomen. Gauntlets covered the giant's powerful hands and he had armored boots that reached below the knee. Charlotte couldn't help but compare the father to an ancient knight ready to frame himself for the mission his lord commanded. But what stood out most of all was the huge sword on his back. Though perhaps the more correct thing to call it would be a broadsword, for it was far too large to be a sword. It was easily taller than Jerry and just as wide as Charlotte's hips. A double-edged blade that ended in a black handle protruded from the giant's shoulder. The blade was of an even darker metal than the handle and had numerous cracks all over it along with obvious rust stains. Despite the broken and unusable appearance, it didn't help the fear they felt looking at it. Those present could feel how the mere act of looking at that knob made their bodies tantalize, and they could feel themselves filled with fear, panic, and anxiety. Before they could do anything about their emotions, Yutravsky draped the blanket over his shoulder, covering the sword again. As if it had been a horrible illusion, all the negative emotions they were feeling disappeared. Ads by PubFuture. Looking at the people in front of him, Yutravsky slowly rose to his full height, his body strong as a mountain. Sorry about that, but it was necessary. You should see it here then when I use it. A small apology and explanation was all the father gave before stepping to the side and pointing to where he was sitting. There was a suit of armor there similar to what the father was wearing, only smaller, and it looked like there was one for each of them. Put that on. The armor is blessed with various rituals and the material it is made of is very strong. It will protect you from what is coming. The first to move and recover was Sasha, who nodded and walked over to the armor that seemed more her size. Placing father's gift to the side, she began by putting on the shoulder pads. She was quickly followed by Jerry and Opera, who also began to put on the armor. Swallowing a bit of saliva, Charlotte looked at father, who had only a calm look on his face, although one eyebrow was slightly raised. Nodding vigorously, he quickly went and put on the armor. Slung back over her shoulder, Sasha looked at father with a serious expression. Next to him were Jerry, Charlotte, and Opera, all wearing armor, but the little girl was also wearing a helmet. Yutravsky looked at everything with a critical eye, and after a few seconds, he nodded in satisfaction. Were they brought up to date? The mountain of a man asked the shorter women, who nodded. Good. Looking at the three people in front of him, his expression became serious, the gentleness in his eyes lessened, and the madness that danced deep within them showed a little more. His mouth opened and the man spoke in the deepest, darkest voice anyone had ever heard him once. After 12 noon today, a fight will begin. It will be like nothing you have ever seen. The doors of the churches will be open to receive the survivors. We will take care of protecting the church for as long as it takes until that nightmare passes. Charlotte paled and Sasha tensed. Jerry and Opera looked fearfully at the father. Again ignoring the reaction his words caused, the elder looked at Sasha and Charlotte. You two will be with me at the front. Did you read the information about what I gave you? Sasha nodded seriously. Good. Upon confirmation, the father turned to a tense Charlotte. As I understand it, you have already advanced to melee scholar, so you will be able to defend yourself well, but you will still stay close to us. Use those charms you squeeze so tightly to cover us in case we get surrounded. Charlotte's lips trembled and he felt his mind seem to fill with fog. He knew what he was getting into was an extremely dangerous path. The boss himself explained it to him multiple times before he agreed and joined. He knew that at some point he would face great dangers, but he didn't think it would be so soon. Confronting Pirate Admiral Kilongos was a different thing. The boss was the one who did all the heavy lifting by coming face to face with that guy while the rest covered for him from the shadows. But this The boss was still missing, so they were on their own. And just when they were without the strongest of the team, he'd have to face something directly. I thought I would have more time. This is too soon. Am I ready for this? Charlotte felt his heart clench, and the fog that was beginning to cloud his judgment grew larger. He had almost died advancing to sequence 8, he wasn't ready at all. A whisper from the past reached his ears, and the fog of doubt that plagued Charlotte was dispelled. Black eyebrows rose in surprise, and he couldn't help but look behind him in search of the voice that spoke so close but also so far away. Uncle, the young man whispered in disbelief. His gaze slightly clouded. Charlotte. The voice of his teammate brought him out of his thoughts. Shaking his head slightly, the man returned his attention to the group in front of him. Sasha looked at him with a somewhat confused expression. The woman named Opera looked at him with a raised eyebrow, while Jerry just narrowed her eyes at him. The father for his part kept the same expression as before. Letting out a shaky sigh, Charlotte nodded to the father. Ads by PubFuture. Understood. If he wanted to accomplish his goal, he had to stand up for himself. Utravsky said no more, just nodded, and turned to look at the remaining people. Opera, you will take care of treating the injured people as they come in. Jerry, try to help her in any way you can. The father's voice became gentler toward the end as he addressed the younger girl. Reaching into a pocket of his pants, Utravsky pulled out a pocket watch and opened it with a click. Looking at the hands of the watch, the father's expression turned hard. It was 30 minutes to noon. Clack. Closing the pocket watch, the father turned to look at the small group. Move the benches and lean them against the walls, we'll need the space. Empress Borough, Bachland Street. Turning the page of her book on ancient Fasak, Hazel was relaxing in her course room. She was sitting on the soft, relaxing sofa as she turned another page. But although her eyes were reading the contents of the book, her mind was not processing the information in it. Turning to the fine and highly detailed clock on her desk, Hazel bit her lips slightly as she saw the time. 20 minutes to noon. Muttering barely above a sigh, Hazel lightly touched a hidden pocket in the dress she was wearing. Feeling the warm charm on her fingertips, she nodded slightly before returning her hand to the book, settling back on the couch so that her hand was always near the pocket that hid the charms. Incantation is son, but they are only a last resort. With the security that father pays for, which is sure to be several Beyonders, quite possibly Middle Sequence and Empress Borough's security, there should be no reason to use them. Hazel comforted herself, but the anxiety in her heart did not lessen but continued to clench her, leaving an uncomfortable taste in her mouth. Swallowing some saliva but failing to eliminate the taste, she looked somewhat annoyed at the door to her room. When will the tea I ordered arrive? Knock knock. Sorry for the delay, Miss Hazel. I couldn't find the tea. A quiet but somewhat timid voice accompanied the maid who had just entered the room. With soft, short yellow hair, watery green eyes, and somewhat delicate features. Hazel's personal maid was a woman that many would consider attractive but would prefer to call her pretty because her face always seemed to be slightly sad despite having a simple smile on her face. Hazel only glanced sideways for a few moments at the woman before returning her attention to the book in her hands. It's fine, Annabeth, just try to not take so long next time. Annabeth looked down somewhat embarrassed and nodded apologetically. Her mistress had ordered the tea 15 minutes ago. Excuse me, Miss Hazel. Seeing the maid who had cared for her since she was a child in that state, Hazel just let out a silent sigh, closed her book, and placed it on her lap. I've already said it doesn't matter, Annabeth. Could you pour my tea, please? Nodding slightly, Annabeth placed the tea set on the small table in front of the couch where Hazel was sitting. Grabbing the teapot, she expertly poured the amber liquid into the cup. 2 sugar cubes, miss. Licking her lips lightly, Hazel felt her sweet tooth stinging. This time make it 4, please. Nodding, Annabeth grabbed the little tweezers and gently placed the 4 sugar cubes her mistress requested. Using the finely detailed silver spoon, she stirred calmly until the lumps were gone. With that done, she handed the steaming cup of tea to her mistress with a slight bow. Here you are, miss. I hope it is to your liking. The noblewoman only nodded slightly, grabbed the saucer of the cup with her left hand, and with her right, she grasped the cup. Her brown eyes gazed into the smooth amber of the tea. Taking a light sip, a sweet smile grew on her face as she felt the warm liquid go down her throat. The mild apple flavor skillfully eliminated the bitter taste from before, and she could feel herself relaxing and sinking slightly into the softness of the sofa. Letting out a pleased sigh, Hazel looked at Annabeth with the corners of her lips raised slightly, as usual, delicious. Annabeth smiled happily and grasping the edges of her dress, she curtsied energetically. It is my pleasure to serve you, miss. East Borough, Termico Street. On what is considered one of the best streets in the entire East Borough, the normal calm atmosphere was now extremely tense. People were looking over their shoulders, looking left, right, everywhere. Fear and uncertainty shone in their eyes, but the biggest emotion in those narrowed eyes was a huge depression. Of all Backland, no other place suffered as much from the disappearance of the fire mage as East Borough. That man had become the light of this abyss, a light that people living in darkness could cling to with all their might. He became the vengeful force that punished their oppressors and set them free. He, alone, had improved the quality of life of all the other people there. He became the shield and the sword of all these people. And he also gave them something impossible, unthinkable to have before. Hope. Hope for a better day. That things will get better. That they could live. That they could sleep on full stomachs. That they didn't have to be afraid to go out on the streets in fear of being murdered, abused, or kidnapped. That they could give their children better lives. Hope that they could be happy. Hope that if they were in a horrible situation, a masked man would burn away all the problems. The people of East Borough had put so much on that man that when he disappeared, the hole he left was impossible to fill. The gangs still didn't trust that the man had really disappeared, so they still kept an almost non-existent profile. But it was only a matter of time. Perhaps the now huge police presence could stop their return to power, but even if that was the case, it would only make people more disgusted. Disgust because they knew that these forces were not there for them but to capture the one who had been with them in their worst moments. The gap between the people of East Borough and the rest of Backland had become almost impossible to cross. Ding, ding. Accompanied by the tinkling of a bell, a slender woman emerged from a tent. Black hair tied in a small ponytail that went over her shoulder, pale skin somewhat sickly. Deep-set eyes and multiple scars on her face, proof of the hard life this person had lived, and wearing a simple dress with several patches and carrying a paper bag strapped to her body. Serena Williams, one of the survivors of the cave and now a humble worker in a bookstore, had just finished her shopping for the day. With heavy steps, she began her walk home with bloodshot eyes and an expression that showed great distress. She released a calloused hand from the bag and taped her chest 4 times. Please Goddess, protect Mr. Kenway. Praying softly and in a dry voice, she repeated the action she had been doing all the time for the past 2 days. If anyone who knew her were to see her now, they would find the scene of her praying quite curious and somewhat surprising. Her faith in the Evernight gods had never been strong, and that was no secret. She had simply used it as a comfort in her time in the cave. She would forget to attend church on Sundays along with the other believers. She never prayed, and often she even felt as if she didn't believe in it at all. She didn't know if there was a word for what she was, but Serena knew she was not a believer. But these past 2 days she had prayed more than she ever had in her entire life. Praying for the safety and well-being of her Savior. She still didn't consider herself a believer, but if kneeling and saying a few words to a figure could help her, Serena would kneel and pray for hours on end until her knees bled from the rough fabric of her dress and her neck seemed to break from holding her head. She would pray. Even in her work, she found herself praying in the hope that however small, it might help her Savior. Shaking her head slightly to clear her mind a bit, despite the improved security, it was still a very bad idea to walk absent-mindedly, and she learned that the hard way when she got captured by the now gone dead Rose. After about 15 minutes, the woman finally reached Star Street. Looking at the old apartment building she called home, Serena let out a small sigh and walked inside. The first thing she saw as soon as she entered was how the tenant was staring into nothingness with a blank expression on his face. A man in his 50s with a huge scar over his left eye and a strong face. His name was William Actis, but he preferred to be called Old Will. Despite the man's tetric appearance, Serena could tell he was a good man and extremely gentle and kind. He was a widower, having lost his wife and son long ago in a horrible factory accident. When she was looking for a new place after losing her horrible residence in the cave, the strange policeman who helped her and the other girls had recommended this place. The rent was extremely cheap, and even with her current salary, she didn't have much trouble paying. And Old Will always tried to help them where he could. When she was kidnapped by Dead Rose, Instead of doing the usual thing of renting out her room as soon as she didn't return one day, he had waited and even notified the police. When she returned after disappearing for 3 days, he welcomed her with open arms and even bought her a small cake and forgave her the month's rent. Old Will was easily one of the best people she had ever had the blessing of knowing. That was why as soon as she saw him in that state she froze. Eyes that once glowed with gentleness had turned into a vacancy that made Serena feel extremely uncomfortable, and to make matters worse they were also reddened, as if he had spent the last 3 hours crying. His nose was a little dirty, but because of the bad lighting, she couldn't quite see what the dirt was, although it looked like dust. Ads by PubFuture. This alone made her want to go outside again. But her trust in the man made her ignore that discomfort. Maybe he's having a bad day. Serena comforted herself as she took a step forward, gaining the attention of those vacant eyes. Giving a quick salute, she kept her head down and with a quickened pace advanced towards the stairs, avoiding eye contact with the man at all times. When she was at the stair landing and was about to ascend to the next floor, her eyes moved slightly to Old Will. The older man was looking at her with a vacant expression that the longer he looked at her the more uncomfortable it made her. No more than 3 seconds could have passed, but she immediately lowered her head and rushed up to the next floor. In her haste she almost dropped her bag with her food but managed to recover. Running down the hallway and past the worn numbered doors, Serena reached number 13 and stuck her hand in her hair. Pulling out a key she tried to fit it, but in her haste, it fell to the floor. Shit. Cursing and extremely nervous, Serena bent down to grab the key, but a horrible chill covered her body, freezing her. She could feel as if someone was watching her. Turning her head quickly, she looked up the stairs in fear that Old Will would be there, but there was no one. Letting out a sigh of relief, Serena let out a nervous laugh as she shook her head. Her skin had turned several shades paler. Grabbing the key and unlocking the door, Serena turned the handle and was about to enter, but the same chill from before returned. She couldn't help but remember her horrible days in the cave and how this sensation was identical to the one she felt from the more dangerous clients, but this time it was much, much greater. Trembling, she turned around, towards door 7 behind her. The door she could have sworn was closed before was now ajar. A pale woman's face peered out slightly and stared at her with the same vacant reddened eyes as Old Will. In the better lit hallway, she could see how her nose was covered in pink dust. Slender fingers with long fingernails gripped the door frame tightly, leaving marks on the door. Pum. Serena's shoulders slammed against the door, and entering her room, she closed it with a bang and wasted no time in locking it. As soon as she did that, a resounding bang 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 began to shake the door, as if someone was trying to force their way inside but couldn't. Huff, huff, huff. Her whole body was shaking, tears were falling from her eyes again, and her breathing was extremely agitated. What's going on? Is that Veronica? And what's wrong with Old Will? I've never seen them like this before. Serena thought in terror, refusing to believe that her friend and tenant could have such a terrifying expression. Turning away from the door and not turning her back on it, Serena was extremely terrified. The bag with her food lay forgotten on the floor. Before she could think of what to do, she felt her mind emptied and had to lean against the wall of her room to keep from falling. What? Confused, she mumbled as she brought a hand to her face. Her eyes moved outward and she felt her stomach drop. Before she knew it, all the sound had disappeared. Boom. A huge explosion sounded in the distance and Serena didn't have time to react before her window exploded. Ah! She fell to the ground and covered her head from the glass. She was immediately grateful for her decision, as not a second later the earth shook. Her whole room. No. The whole building was shaking. Serena's eyes widened in horror, her troubled mind suddenly sharpened, and she did her best not to hit her head. It felt like the earth was going to open up and swallow her. Everything in her room began to move from side to side, the single bed crashing against the wall with force. The closet in the corner fell to the floor and crawled with speed to the other side. Dust was falling from the ceiling and the creaking of wood could be heard everywhere. It seemed like the building would fall on her at any moment. Hugging her head and staying in a corner in a fetal position, Serena, not knowing what to do, stood still and waited for it all to be over. But as more time passed, the earth shook even more, and the fear that the building would fall on her was now greater. I have to get out of here. Terrified, Serena staggered towards the door of her room, but halfway there she stopped. Not only had she locked the door, but Veronica was still outside. Serena knew that opening the door in this situation was almost or even more dangerous than staying here, so turning around in anguish and terror, she looked for another way to escape. Her eyes immediately found the window. Doubt filled the woman's mind. After all, this was the second floor. A fall could break something and she didn't have enough money for a visit to the doctor. Crack. Crack. Ads by PubFuture. Any doubts she had left her mind as she heard the creak of wood and a huge crack appeared in the wall next to her, and also heard how a part of the door broke. Moving as fast as she could and doing her best not to fall as it would mean death, Serena barely dodged her bed and grabbed the window frame. Grabbing it, she opened it as wide as she could and jumped out. She felt something try to grab her heel but failed and could only scratch her. With a loud thud, her body hit the ground and all the air left her lungs. Tears fell from her eyes from the pain, but forcing herself to stand up, and even with the earthquake getting stronger, she moved in search of a safe place. But she barely took a few steps when she froze again. Deep in East Borough, a huge plume of smoke was rising to the sky, surely the place where the explosion came from earlier. All was absolute chaos, horses freed from their carriages running and trampling people, the same carriages lying across the street blocking it. Same streets that had huge cracks growing in them, and she could swear that something was moving in those. She could see how a person had been crushed by one of the carriages. By his clothes it might have been the driver. But that wasn't the worst of it. Down the sidewalks and alleys, she could see how people were lying on the ground and frothing with foam coming out of their mouths. Their bodies twisting in horrible ways, and Serena was sure that if it wasn't for everything that was going on, she could hear those people's bones snapping relentlessly. The people who were not on the ground watched frozen as the skin of all of them peeled back, showing red muscle that grew in size, their fingers elongated supernaturally, and their fingernails grew into blades. Black veins moved where the skin had not yet fallen, and where it had already fallen a thick black liquid-like pus gushed out. Creesh pum. At the loud sound, Serena turned around and looked with pain as the building where she lived had collapsed. A huge cloud of dust spread through the chaotic street, and she instinctively closed her eyes to prevent it from entering them. Her building was not the only one, as several others also collapsed, surely killing the people still inside. Serena looked around her, and despite the thick fog of dust that was surely covering her, what little she could see clearly. And that was death. Her mind didn't even have time to process even a sliver of what was happening before the whole world seemed to freeze. Every sound, action, thought, sensation, and emotion was killed, and even the people and animals running in terror through the streets froze in place. From one second to the next, similar or worse to the previous event, the whole world seemed to go dark. Everyone who could still move looked up. Defying all rule and natural order, at 12 p.m. and hanging in a clear black sky that a moment ago was covered in yellowish clouds, hung the huge crimson moon that shone with bloody light. A blood moon. But despite this supernatural event, what most terrified Serena and all who witnessed this event was how in the distance and piercing through the dust that seemed to cover all of East Borough, something was rising rapidly. Rising into the sky as if it wished to pierce it like a spear, it pierced through the smoke and destruction that its ascension was causing. A huge redwood tree grew, illuminated by the bloody light of the moon, enveloping it like a mother cuddles her baby after delivery. Its branches stretched out into the void in search of their mother, but failing to find her they could only writhe in frustration like the legs of a spider. The tree exceeded a dark bloody glow. A sinful glow, yet holy at the same time, a perverse and dark holiness, an attack on the divine and sacred. Depravity taking physical form. At that moment the earth stopped trembling, as the top of the tree reached its peak. Illuminated by the bloody moon and with its back to the blasphemous tree. The people on the ground began to rise. Gray dust covered their bodies, but this only served to emphasize the horrible transformation they had undergone. Those who were once normal people had become demons. Men, women, children, homeless, workers, it no longer mattered. Bleeding red muscle stained the remnants of clothes that were torn due to the rapid swelling of the body and sticking even more dust. Elongated hands ending in sharp claws of white bone. Eyes completely black and foam falling from mouths full of sharp black teeth. Nobody moved. All the people were completely frozen in front of the image that seemed to be taken directly from their worst nightmares. Unfortunately for them, the monsters did not share the feeling. Growls of bloodthirsty beasts came from these, and Serena finally felt herself gaining control of her body again. Turning around and making herself as small as she could to take advantage of the fog of dust that still covered the street, Serena ran as fast as she could at the same time as screams and sounds of flesh being cut sounded. She barely made it a few steps before something slammed into her back, knocking her to the messy ground. Her head hit first and the world went blurry, and for a few seconds, everything went black. But it was only an instant. As soon as the rest of her body hit the ground, the world gained that horrible crimson color again. Help me. Looking over her shoulder at what had hit her, Serena saw in a daze the bloody face of a young woman with blood pouring from her mouth in great quantities and extremely pale. Her once bright eyes now looked dull and lost. Before the panic could continue, her eyes moved down to the body of the woman, who was wearing a simple dress, which because of the dust that covered her it was impossible to tell the color, and continued down until she stopped at the distinct lack of legs. Viscera hung like a tail and covered her legs with warm crimson. She could see how a few paces away was the creature that had done that. If the legs in its claws were any indication of it, those abyss of eyes looked to where the rest of its prey had fallen. Every muscle in Serena's body froze. She even stopped breathing and quickly closed her eyes, playing dead. Please don't let it see me. Please don't let it see me. She couldn't see anything due to her eyes being closed, but she could still hear and feel. Serena could hear the way those things tore people apart, the way various things fell to the ground with dry, wet thuds. The last breaths of life of the people as they died just a few feet away from them. She could feel how more warm liquid covered her waist, making her want to vomit. But what she could feel most of all was the horrible look of that thing on her. Any hope that her performance had worked died, and she immediately tried desperately to get the woman's body off of her. Years of malnutrition, sickness, and abuse of all kinds came to the surface, making her unable to do that. Even if the woman on top of her was in a similar or worse state than her own, Serena didn't have the strength to get the woman off of her. She could only watch helplessly as that monster tossed aside the rest of the woman's body. It let out a horrible shriek and lunged at her. The world seemed to slow down. The monster seemed to float in the air, moving extremely slowly. Serena could see how foam came out of its mouth, how blood dripped from its claws, and how those empty black eyes seemed to want to devour her soul. Bang! The familiar sound of a gun firing caused the world to move back to normal speed. The creature's head moved abnormally to one side, and the side of the head exploded into a pink and black cloud. The dead body of the thing hit the ground with a thud. The hole in its head released steam, and she could see a small golden light coming out of it. Her eyes widened in shock, and she quickly looked at the source of the shot. Standing on top of a ruined carriage and wearing a shirt that was covered in dust, ruining the previous blue color, with an impossible to control brown hair. Blood was dripping from a cut on his forehead, and his face was extremely dirty. Around him were 5 people, all in a similar state to him. Each of them had either a revolver or a machine gun in their hands. She was still frozen, but she came out of her stupor when someone carefully removed the woman's body from on top of her. Can you move? The man asked as he looked around with a gun in his right hand. Soft features and blue eyes that conveyed tranquility. Serena only gave a weak nod, and taking the man's hand he easily helped her up. East Borough is no longer safe. Go towards Sherwood Borough, to any of the churches there, you'll be safe there. Do you know how to get there? Why yes, but I don't know any churches. Serena stammered as she barely managed to find her balance and tried to ignore how warm her legs felt. The man just nodded. Serena could see the slight disappointment in his eyes, but it quickly left him. It doesn't matter. If you go to Tumerco Street and take exit 3, you'll just need to keep going straight until you get to Rose Street. The church there is impossible to miss. Rumble. They both turned quickly to the sound of moving debris, and Serena watched stunned as from the rubble of her building, one of those creatures staggered out, a huge chunk of wood piercing her side, but it didn't seem to bother her movement too much. Serena recognized the shredded dress she was wearing as Veronica's. The man didn't even take a second, as no sooner had the creature emerged he had already raised his gun and pulled the trigger several times. Bang! Bang! Veronica's head exploded in a pink and black cloud, and her body fell motionless to the ground. But she was not the only one to emerge from the rubble. Some of the creatures that had survived the collapse of some buildings were slowly getting up, horribly wounded and barely able to move, but even that would not stop their bloodlust. Go! Shouting that order, the man pulled the trigger of his gun several times, killing several of those creatures that had rushed towards them. Serena nodded with tears in her eyes, and with staggering but swift steps, she ran towards Tumerco Street. Looking at the woman Kowalski had helped, Deacon of the Machinery Hivemind Ekenzer Bernard, held a smoking revolver with a bitter expression as he reloaded a fresh batch. What's going on? The man muttered as he pulled the trigger again, and a modified demon hunting bullet for added power ripped through the head of another one of those things, making it explode. Not only an explosion followed by an earthquake, but it also summoned something that seems straight out of Emperor Russell's horror stories. This day can't get any worse. Pushing those thoughts out of his mind, the deacon raised his voice and shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the ruined street. Everyone who can move, help the wounded and get them out of here. We'll take care of the monsters. Glancing at his team, he expertly stowed the revolver in his holsters on his belt and grabbed the machine gun at his side. Permission to use artifacts. Help as many as you can and stay together. The entire team nodded, and following their captain's orders, they opened fire on the monsters. While the hivemind machinery was firing left and right, the street below was still in chaos. Some of the people wasted no time in following the orders and helped the wounded people, while many others simply fled the scene. Everything remained in chaos, which only hindered the hivemind machinery and helped the monsters kill more people. Similar scenes happened all over East Borough. Teams from the 3 churches that were originally there to capture the fire mage were fighting the monsters while trying to help the survivors. Wind blades slashed and shredded, nightmares put monsters to sleep who were then finished off, and golden bullets pierced and annihilated the monsters. East Borough had become an all-out war zone where the main objective was to survive. Forgotten had been the pages she had been writing, the table had been knocked over and the ink fell, staining and ruining several of them, but the writer couldn't care less. Fur's wall was now writhing in pain in the arms of her best friend, who was desperately at a loss as to what to do. A pool of blood was growing around her from the wounds that were appearing on her body. The writer's brown hair had grown long and almost down to her feet, her veins were visible as they swelled and throbbed like worms under her skin. Blood was dripping from every orifice of her face and her skin was taking on an abnormally pale hue. Furs, hold on please. Zio cried as she tightly hugged her friend, who could only sob from the pain. Despair was clear on her face as she saw how one of the most important people in her life was transforming into a monster. Furs sank her head into her friend's chest and sobbed as if she were a little girl. It hurts, Zio. It hurts so much. Ads by PubFuture. With tear-filled eyes, all Zio could do was hug Furs tighter against her. She didn't understand what was happening. A second ago it was daytime and now it was night. A night of blood moon. Grr. Furs was trying to swallow the pain, but she couldn't. She could feel her body breaking and something wanted to come out. The ravings that were roaring in her ear were the worst she had ever suffered. They had never been so loud, so clear, so close as they were now. Her mind was sinking and she could feel her sanity slipping. If this kept up, at any moment she would lose control. And Zio knew that too, as her grip on Furs grew tighter, refusing to let her go. The sheriff looked around for anything that could help her, but the whole room was in chaos. The natural disorder of the room didn't help, but with the disaster of the earthquake it would be impossible for her to find the first aid kit. And if she wanted to find it, she would have to let her friend go. And it seems that Furs noticed this too, because she stopped holding her head and wrapped her arms around her waist. Her fingernails that now looked more like claws scratched her back, causing blood to come out, but Zio couldn't care less. Don't leave me, don't leave me, don't leave me, don't leave me. Furs pleaded in a deep voice with tears of blood falling from her eyes that were bloodshot. I'm here, Furs. I'm here. Zio could only hug her tighter against her body as she tried to comfort her friend. Her eyes moved to her triangular sword that was on the ground a few feet away from them, but as soon as she found it she looked away and returned her attention to her friend. She didn't want to think about what would happen if Furs lost control and turned into a monster. She didn't know if she would be able to keep her promise to her friend if that happened. Helplessness filled her and Zio could only curse to herself. This was just like when her father died and she was forced to flee along with her family. How weak she felt on that day when she had to abandon everything. She was feeling it again now. She could only close her eyes tightly as she held Furs close to her, whose grip was getting weaker and voice lower to the point that her arms dropped, her strength unable to keep them up. No, 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 no. Shaking her head in denial, Zio placed her hand against her friend's chest and felt her heartbeat getting slower and slower. Laying Furs down on the floor, the sheriff placed both hands on her friend's chest and began pumping. She couldn't let the heart stop. She knew that if that happened Furs would undoubtedly lose control. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. She counted each beat, her knightly training shining through in this dire situation, as she looked at the pale face of Furs who was staring at the ceiling with lost eyes, her breathing much weaker than before. Gritting her teeth so hard that veins popped out of her neck, Zio kept up her pace as she prayed with all her might. Please goddess. Don't take her from me too. Not her. Please goddess. No matter how hard she tried, she could feel Furs' heart slowing down and the puddle at her feet beneath her growing larger. Stay with me. Furs. Stay with me. The only sign that the writer was still conscious was how her blue eyes moved slightly towards her. A huge sadness in them. The bloody light coming through the window seemed to be taunting her. Telling her that her efforts were futile and that it would all be in vain, that its crimson glow would take her friend and turn her into a monster. She could watch as slowly more of that foul light entered the room and approached them. Tears almost completely blurred her vision at the realization that at any moment her friend would close her eyes and lose her forever. Everything became irrelevant, all input from her current job. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The bloody light only seemed to grow and it was already a few steps away from touching them, but just before it did, a golden light repelled it. All anxiety in Zio died as the warm light touched her body and she could feel Furs' heart gaining strength rapidly. Zio watched in astonishment as golden light suddenly illuminated her room and she turned her gaze to the window. Rising on the horizon and repelling the crimson light with holy light, the sun shone with power, rising high to meet the moon. Before she could make sense of what was happening, everything was suddenly blanketed in absolute darkness. The crimson light and the golden light disappeared into it. Not a single star could be seen. The sky turned completely black. It didn't even take a second for the sun to rise before it disappeared back into the darkness. Zio would have thought it was all an illusion or a game of her mind if it weren't for the warm blood on her hands. She could only watch in disbelief as the only light illuminated backland, emerging from the titanic tree that stood deep in the East Burrow. Long columns of smoke and fire could be seen from where she stood. Her mind was again unable to make sense of what was happening. What's going on? Zio muttered in disbelief and stupefaction. How had she not seen that before? A sudden movement in her hand made her head spin so fast downwards that it looked like she had broken her neck. Grr! Growling in a weak voice, Furs' eyes slowly opened. Her hair was still too long, but it was slowly returning to normal, as were her nails, which already looked more like a person's. Regaining her senses a bit but still feeling like everything was a blur, Furs looked at her friend with teary eyes. Quote. Zio. The newly mentioned looked at her friend in shock for several seconds, before she wrapped her arms around her, sunking her head into her chest, and sobbed. Tears of happiness fell from her green eyes. Furs, who didn't understand what was happening, only gave a weak smile before falling unconscious. Zio wasn't alarmed this time because she could hear her friend's heart beating normally, but still, she didn't let go. She continued to sink into her friend's chest and let the soft smell of cigarettes and coffee from her soothe her. Help. Monster. Ads by PubFuture. Crash. But Zio couldn't celebrate anymore because a scream in the street and the sound of the window shattering made her raise her head immediately. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed her triangular sword from the ground with blood-covered hands and stood in front of the lying Furs. Thump, thump, thump. The heavy footsteps of something climbing the stairs caused her grip on her sword to tighten and her eyes to sharpen. She snapped into guard and the majestic aura that always surrounded her grew a little stronger. Gree. Barely a second later, a high-pitched shriek sounded in the hallway in front of the room's door, confusing Zio immensely. What was that? Thump, 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 crash. The door to the room shattered like wet cardboard, but Zio didn't let that scare her but quickly placed her sword in front and blocked the intruder's swing. Something sharp collided with her sword, causing sparks to fly and momentarily illuminate the room, allowing the Sharif to get a good look at the intruder in her house. With a mossy appearance of red muscle with dripping black pus, pitch black eyes, and razor-sharp teeth. Elongated fingers ending in claws that promised to tear her apart if she let them near, Zio's pupils shrank. A Beyander that lost control. Her grip on the handle of her sword became so tight that her knuckles turned white. Any idea of neutralization was thrown out the window. The only way to deal with a Beyander that lost control was elimination. So Zio shifted her stance slightly and readied herself. Quickly raising her guard to the maximum, Zio blocked with her sword again the claws of the thing that seemed to be smiling darkly and sinisterly at her. Zio let out a slight grunt as she gave a powerful kick to the monster's stomach and pushed it away from her, which was immediately followed by a slash with her sword aimed at its neck. The blade of her sword plunged into the red and porous flesh, but contrary to what she expected, it only plunged halfway, failing to completely decapitate her enemy. Zio tried to continue his slash, but the monster would not let himself be killed without first damaging its prey as much as possible. Letting out a gurgle choked by its dark blood, it launched a thrust with its claws, wanting to impale and scatter the sheriff's organs on the ground. Due to how close she was to the creature, Zio would not be able to get away from the creature in time, so taking advantage of the height difference, she swooped down and the lunge missed. Taking advantage of the inertia, Zio grabbed with her free hand what was left of the creature's clothes and with a hip twist whipped it to the ground while continuing her slash. With a mighty blow, the monster's body crashed to the floor while its head flew and crashed against the other side of the room. After a few short spasms, the monster's body stopped moving. Staring at the monster out of control with her bloodied sword firmly clenched in her hand, Zio kept her guard at maximum in case something else happened, but after a few seconds of nothing, she finally let out a somewhat agitated sigh and lowered her sword. What could have lured an out-of-control Beander here? She thought, extremely confused as she looked at the headless body in the middle of her friend's room. Even though everything was now extremely dark and it was difficult for her to see, she could still make out the monstrous appearance of the poor wretch who lost control. As far as she could tell, this was once a man, wearing what appeared to be the remains of a simple suit. So this is what a Beander looks like when it loses control. Zio found herself somewhat disturbed. This was the first Beander that lost control she had ever seen and dealt with. She let out a soundless sigh and closed her eyes, taping her chest 4 times, praying to the goddess for this guy's soul. When she opened them again, her heart stopped. The figure of the man was changed to that of a woman wearing a simple white sleep dress that was torn and covered in blood. The unknown head was replaced by a familiar face with blue eyes that had tears of blood falling from them. She blinked again and the body returned to that of a man. Leaning against the wall, Zio brought a hand to her chest where her heart seemed to want to explode, new tears falling from her face. She could feel herself fading, but the screams outside kept her anchored. Her mind flashed back to that horrible illusion she saw, a terrible reminder of what she would have had to do if Furs lost control. Emerald orbs moved to the unconscious writer and then moved to the bloody triangular sword in her hands. Clank. Dropping the sword with a trembling hand, Zio brought a hand to her face and let out a long, highly charged sigh. If it had come to that. Her eyes returned to the writer, a grim expression on her face. I don't think I would have been able to do it. Clenching her fists tightly, Zio could only shake her head. With heavy steps she walked over to Furs, and with a little more difficulty than she would like to admit, the sheriff lifted her into her arms, being careful not to let the bloodied sword touch her. I won't let you rest here, she thought as she looked at the blood that seemed to cover the entire room, at the headless body and the shattered door. Making sure her friend was comfortable, Zio walked out of the room. Reaching her own, she carefully opened it and stepped inside. Laying her friend down on her bed, not caring in the least that she was covered in blood, Zio reached down and pulled out a first aid kit from under her bed. She placed it on her bedside table, and after doing so, she went out for a few moments. When she returned, she was carrying a bucket of warm water along with some towels and a simple blue dress. Making sure the door was locked and they were safe, she knelt beside the bed, her sword close to her in case anything else happened. With a somewhat familiar hand thanks to the teachings of her current patient, Zio carefully undressed her friend and began to clean her of all the blood that covered her. As she moved on to clean her friend's back, Zio was doing her best to ignore the cries for help coming from outside. As much as she wanted to help, she could not. She had to take care of her best friend. Please forgive me, Zio thought with a heavy heart, a look of deep sadness in her eyes. Empress Burrow. Hall Villa. Don't worry, sweetie. Everything will be fine. I'm sure the church's forces are doing everything they can to sort this out. Caitlin Hall comforted her daughter, who was in her arms. The last mentioned pet was sitting glued to her feet doing her guard dog job. Her personal servants were off to the side checking that everything in the bunker was in order, while some guards were making sure that the bunker was protected. Everyone present was covered in dust, some more than others, as in the case of the servants. Some had bruises and cuts, a few had bandages wrapped around their arms or heads. Even the prestigious and powerful Hall family was not spared, Audrey had a bandage wrapped around her right arm where she had been cut by broken glass. As soon as the explosion and the earthquake had passed, the entire Hall family, those present at the moment as one of the sons was in Byam, were transported to the bunker under the mansion. Earl Hall watched his beloved wife and only daughter as he scratched the collar of his shirt, his face impassive as a rock. Next to him was his eldest son Hibbert Hall, who tried to look composed like his father, but the slight nervousness in him was noticeable. Both men were covered in dust. Hibbert had a bruise on his cheek while Earl had a bandage wrapped around his head. "Take a deep breath, son. That will help your nerves," Earl commented casually with his back straight as he settled his tall hat. The fine expensive material felt soft to his fingers. Hibbert nodded slightly at his father's words. He took a slow breath to regain his composure. After a few seconds, he asked in a somewhat disbelieving voice, "Father, what was that?" "That, my son, was an earthquake," Earl Hall commented without changing his expression. Hibbert's eyebrow twitched slightly. Swallowing his annoyance, he continued, "I know what it was, father. But in Backland, there's never been an earthquake in Backland." For the first time in the last few minutes, the expression of the head of the family changed. His brows furrowed slightly and he let out a slight sigh. "I am in the same darkness as you, Hibbert. I don't know how this is possible, and also that explosion. I fear this could be an attack by Fasak or Intis." Hibbert bit the inside of his cheek, something all the sons of the family did when they were nervous. Taking a slight breath, he replied seriously, "An attack like that out of the blue? Father, relations with the Fasak Empire and the Intis Republic have been strained and even somewhat aggressive, but I find myself on the side of denying that possibility. There is no human weapon that could set off an explosion big enough to cause an earthquake." Earl Hall's eyes twitched for a moment before he fell silent for long seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy, carrying the weight of age and the emotion of a worried father. "I've already sent a telegram to the Church of the Evernight Gods. It's only a matter of time before we find out what's going on out there." Turning to look at his son, Earl Hall added, "Now try to act like a man and try to stay calm. We don't want to scare your mother and sister anymore." Hibbert, who was about to speak again, immediately swallowed his words. What his father had said was like a bucket of cold water and he found himself abnormally calm. He immediately understood the reason for this and straightening up, he held his head high. The duty of an older brother will always be to protect the younger sibling. He might not be a Beander like Alfred, but that wouldn't mean he wouldn't do everything he could to defend his family. This long but also short exchange was watched by crystalline emerald eyes that hid a mixture of some exasperation and a lot of affection. Easily reading what her brother was thinking, Audrey rolled her eyes internally as she sunk her head into her mother's chest, who was trembling, and she could feel her grip getting tighter. "As soon as I get the chance, I'll go to the bathroom and pray to Mr. Fool. I'm sure he will know what's going on." With eyes shining determinedly, Audrey hoped the opportunity would come soon. But from the way the back of her neck felt slightly wet, she doubted her mother would let go any time soon. Swallowing saliva, Audrey bit the inside of her cheek and could feel her body begin to tremble slightly. No matter how much she tried to deny it, she was scared too. A few minutes ago she had experienced her first earthquake firsthand as she watched it turn dark all at once. It would be strange for her not to be afraid. Elsewhere in Empress Borough, everything around her was spinning, a horrible buzzing sound threatening to burn a hole in her brain. After a few seconds, Hazel realized she was lying on the floor of her room. Above her was the couch she had previously been lying on. Her brown eyes drifted to the side and she could see her expensive ceramic set broken, her favorite mug now shattered to pieces a few feet away from her. But her attention wasn't on that. No, her attention was on the legs of a woman dressed as a maid lying a few feet away from them. Ugh! A sharp pain caused her to bring her hand to her forehead and she could feel something warm. Lowering her hand, she saw how it was covered in red. "I have a cut on my head. A concussion is very likely," Hazel thought somewhat dazedly as her sight went down to her torso. Her dress was ruined, the neck was stained with the blood from her head and torn in several places. To her relief, there didn't seem to be any bloodstains further down. Unfortunately, her dress prevented her from seeing her legs and their condition, but judging by how she felt them, everything was as it should be. "My only and most serious wound is in my head." Letting out a shaky sigh, Hazel turned to what she asked would be the unconscious woman and called out in a somewhat tinny voice. "Annabeth. Annabeth, talk to me." For a few seconds there was no response, but just as her heart was racing, her maid stirred slightly. Say miss. Annabeth spoke with clear weakness and sleepiness in her voice, with slurred speech, dancing between consciousness and unconsciousness. Hazel clicked her tongue softly, with clear annoyance. She won't be able to move in that state. I'll have to do this alone. Without alarm or shock, her training kicked in, her mind cooled and her eyes sharpened. She placed her hands on the edge of the couch and pushed, lifting the furniture with little difficulty. Satisfied with the space she made, and with one smooth, nimble movement, Hazel slid out of her trap, skillfully avoiding the broken ceramic on the floor. Ads by PubFuture. Looking around her room, Hazel's expression fell slightly. The only way to describe it would be as if a tornado had passed through. Everything was out of place. Her bed was upside down and clearly broken. Her multiple decorations hanging on the wall were scattered all over the finely polished wood floor, expensive imported Intis and Fasak ceramics just as broken as her tea set. The windows were mostly broken, tearing the curtains. But that wasn't what she focused her attention on, just giving them a pass. Her attention was focused almost entirely on the wall and ceiling, looking for cracks or any sign that it might fall. But she finally allowed herself to let out a sigh of relief when none of those signs showed up. The great matched mansion stood strong through the earthquake. The fortune spent to make it, one that easily could feed 50 middle-class families for months at a time, proved to be the best investment her great-great-grandfather could have made. Good job, Grandpa, Hazel thanked quietly as she approached Annabeth. This close she could see the state of her maid. Her right forearm was bent and she had a large gash on her scalp that spurted out a stream of blood. Broken arm. Because of the lack of blood, the bone did not go through the flesh. A wound on the head. Her sharp eyes scanned the body for any other wounds, and seeing that she hadn't skipped anything, she just nodded softly, bent down, and gripped the edge of her dress tightly. Carreri. Carefully wrapping her caregiver's head with the fabric of her dress, which was quickly stained red, as well as making a makeshift sling out of it, Hazel used the remaining fabric to do the same to her head. That done, Hazel looked down at the heels she was wearing and shook her head with a frown. She couldn't walk comfortably across her room in heels, so grabbing the heel, a resounding zap sounded. If Annabeth were conscious, she would faint at the sight of the 1,000+ pound heels being snapped like a mere twig. Testing her footing, Hazel smiled in satisfaction. With the wounds she could treat finished and with new shoes, the noblewoman bent down and carefully grabbed the woman's healthy arm and placed it over her shoulder. With extreme care, she stood up, lifting the woman's unconscious body with her. The strength of a swindler was nothing compared to that of a pugilist, but at least it was enough for her to carry Annabeth and not stagger with each step. A few steps away from reaching the door, it burst open. He dialed crashing hard into the wall, causing her to tense up and unconsciously try to grab the charms that were still hidden in her dress with her free hand. But before her fingers could touch the warm metal of them, she stopped when she saw who it was that had opened the door. A sense of relief washed over her as she saw that it was someone somewhat familiar. The one who opened the door was a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, with white streaks in his hair and a well-groomed mustache, wearing an elegant suit that highlighted his strong body. Hazel recognized him as one of the guards that her father hired some time ago. He looked visibly surprised at her current state and how she was carrying her maid, but recovered immediately. The professionalism of a guard shone through and he quickly approached her. "Miss Hazel, are you all right?" Her brow furrowed slightly, but keeping her elegance and politeness above all else, the noblewoman nodded. "I'm fine, but Annabeth sustained serious injuries. Carry her." The calm with which she had spoken came as a considerable surprise to the guard, who looked quizzical. This only made Hazel click her tongue internally, but she swallowed it. This was not the situation to make enemies, especially someone who was quite possibly stronger than her. Carry her. Recovering and giving a sharp nod, the guard quickly walked over to her and carefully grabbed the maid from her arms. "Something happens to her and you're fired." Pursing his lips, the guard nodded slightly and added more care to his grip. Annabeth's face frowned slightly but returned to its former state not long after. Making sure her maid was comfortable, Hazel looked into the guard's experienced eyes. "Where are my parents?" "Mr. and Mrs. Matched are in the dining room, miss. They are waiting for you." Nodding, Hazel simply nodded. "Let's go." Walking down the hallway filled with shattered paintings and broken furniture, the noblewoman's brow furrowed more and more. Her exterior didn't show it, but she was quite worried about the rest. She hoped they were all right. The large double doors to the dining room were open, so her arrival was seen by the group of over 24 people inside. Among them were servants and maids, cooks, guards, and so on. The vast majority of them had blood bandages covering their heads or had their arms wrapped in bandages. Hazel didn't get much of a look before she was enveloped in a powerful hug which she saw coming but gladly received and returned. Her expression softened slightly as she heard the sob. The woman who was hugging her was wearing an expensive dark purple ball gown with black accents but which was now full of dust and some torn parts, blackish green hair very similar to her own, and soft brown eyes. She was her mother, Rihanna matched. Ads by PubFuture. The man on her side was pushing 40. He had black hair and brown eyes, much darker than those of his wife and daughter. He had a deep outline with a receding hairline. His face was long and thin. Both parents were with multiple cuts and their clothes were extremely dirty. I was so worried. Let me look at you. You didn't get hurt, did you? Gloved hands touched her face. Older brown eyes widened in horror at the sight of the makeshift bandage on her head, by the goddess. Her father wasted no time in raising his voice. Doctor. Doctor. My daughter is hurt. Rolling her eyes internally, Hazel grabbed her mother's hands and carefully removed them from her face. Mother, father, I'm fine. It's just a cut. Her mother shook her head and continued to check her over as the family's doctor arrived, a man in his late 50s whose face showed his age and experience. With a black leather briefcase in his right hand, he spoke, Miss Hazel, please let me at least check you. If that cut becomes infected, it will be more difficult to treat. Mr. Match nodded with a stern expression. You'd better take a seat, honey. The sooner this passes, the better you can rest. Hazel shook her head and pointed to Annabeth, who was still being carried by the guard. First attend her. Her wounds are more serious than mine. All sound in the dining room stopped. The servants who overheard the conversation looked at the lady in astonishment. The guards hid it better, but they too were shocked. Her parents' eyes widened in stupefaction and disbelief, unable to believe what their daughter had said. Hazel matched, well known for being an arrogant and spoiled child. She had asked for someone to be treated before her. A commoner nonetheless. Shaking off the shock, her father spoke first. Of course we will treat her, dear, but you are the priority. Once the doctor sees the wound on your head, he will treat Annabeth. Hazel gave her father a hard look and rejected this, she first. Despite being a man of character, the man found himself unable to return his daughter's intensity. Luckily for him, his wife jumped in to help him. Hazel, look at me. With a serious face, her daughter obeyed. You are the sole heir of the family. Your health is the most important thing to us. A simple. What makes her less than me? At the sudden question, Rihanna swallowed her words and looked at her daughter with saucer-like eyes. Hazel's brow was furrowed in disgust, anger, and disappointment. Disappointment in them caused Rihanna to hold a hand to her chest and her father to freeze. Everyone present watched the exchange between the heads of the family and the young miss with their mouths hanging open. Answer me. Father, mother, what makes her less than me? Is it because she is a servant? Or is it because she is not a noble? Hazel, dear, Mr. Match tried to say something, but his daughter's burning gaze silenced him. How can you be part of the new party and not practice what you say? Annabeth is more injured than me, but you want to prioritize my health over hers. How can you take that seat and turn your back on your promises like that? Quote. With his jaw trembling slightly, all Mr. Match could do was lower his gaze in shame. His wife was the same. Hazel snorted and looked at the doctor, who almost looked like his jaw would drop. Treat her. Yes, Miss Matched. Without wasting any time, the doctor quickly opened his briefcase and carefully began to remove the cloth wrapped around the maid's head. As he did this, the man couldn't help but notice the high quality of the blackened cloth, which caught his attention. Paying a little more attention to it, his eyes widened in shock as he saw how the parts that were not obscured by the blood had a fine pattern. Her attention moved to the lady's dress that shared the same pattern. Disbelief filled his heart, and before he could point out his discovery, the heiress of the family spoke. Is there a problem? Swallowing a bit of saliva, the doctor shook his head and stowed the soiled fabric in the briefcase. No, miss. This was something the Lord had to know, but now was not the time. Now he would focus on treating the woman's wounds, and when everything calmed down, he would report his discovery to Mr. Matched. Hazel noticed how the doctor moved the improvised bandage he had made but did not comment on it. She thought about it for a few moments before her lips lifted slightly. With everything calmer and no longer so focused on helping Annabeth, Hazel focused her attention on the dining room window, her gaze on the black sky. Her heart pounding at such a strange yet disturbing scene. I hope the rest is all right. Mr. Match looked at his daughter with an expressionless face. His pride as a man and nobleman had taken a bit of a beating, but his pride as a father was now so great that he could barely contain his smile. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw how his wife was smiling at their daughter, a mother's pride shining in the brown eyes he loved so much. Craboom. Took them longer than I thought, commented with an amused smile the doctor. He looked up into the darkness high above what was left of what could have been considered the ceiling, to the flashes of white lights that appeared from time to time. The darkness that curved around the cavern became weaker, becoming only a river of shadows that was illuminated by a strong crimson light coming from the place where the pillar used to be. Bump bump, bump bump. Ignoring the heartbeat, his crimson eyes turned to the crater where the blood lake he had worked so hard to make once stood and which was now almost empty. His eyes twinkled with a hint of melancholy before he let out a light chuckle. The lake had served its purpose with great marks, so there was no need to be sad. His attention returned to the bottom of the crater and he couldn't help but let out an extremely pleased chuckle. With the blood gone, it was much easier to see the bottom, so one could see how easily the crater was over 100 meters deep. What do you think, Mr. Kenway? Do you like the anniversary? The man asked, accompanied by a soft chuckle. Deep in the crater and face up was the body of Adrian Kenway. The great beauty that always seemed to accompany the man was gone, being replaced by a horrible transformation that was hard to look at without wanting to vomit or frown in disgust and revulsion. The man's pale skin had turned completely red and swollen, his fiery red hair was gone, leaving only a head of swollen red skin that appeared to be peeling. The only thing that could point to the body being his was the chain still attached to the necklace around his neck. Looking at the state of the body, the doctor could only let out a long and extremely heavy sigh that carried a huge and brutal sadness, as if he had just found out that he lost his mother. It always hurts to see something beautiful die. His sight then went down to the corpse's abdomen. Unlike what he expected, the stomach was only slightly swollen and boobly. It was as if the man had ingested a large amount of liquid before he died. Something obvious considering he was drowning while being cooked alive. The abdomen was not grotesquely swollen, nor did it look like something was going to rip the inside out. His lips pursed, followed by the clicking of his tongue, but as soon as the annoyance showed itself it disappeared, his eyes gaining a disinterested glint. Rolling his shoulders, the doctor didn't think much of it. He's a herald after all, if they were that easy to corrupt then, he muttered barely above a sigh. His eyes gazed into the distance, slightly clouded, lost in the horizon of memories. After a few seconds he sighed again. Shaking his head, his eyes turned to look at Joseph, who was looking at the body with an intense gaze. Do you want me to restore it? Shaking his head softly, Joseph licked his lips, his fingers trembling slightly. No, my lord. Now that I see it like this, I can hardly contain myself. The swollen, red, juicy flesh. I bet its skin will peel easily. The muscle underneath will be soft. Licking his lips that suddenly felt dry, while a moan or two escaped, Joseph felt a huge hunger inside him. He couldn't wait to deeply taste that delicious and juicy dish that he knew well had an exquisite flavor, and now that it was cooking in the blood, what a majestic taste it would have now. But he knew that the meat after slow cooking had to rest, so swallowing his saliva, he looked away from the body. Wraith Steve beside him gave him a bored and somewhat jaded look. Werewolf Tyre and Zombie Jason stood a few steps further away but were looking at the body in the crater with a big grin. The satisfaction of seeing the bastard who buried them in rubble in such a state was huge, and they couldn't help but let out a smile. The only reason they weren't laughing was because they didn't want to offend the doctor. And behind them were two people who had their heads down, madness barely contained in their eyes. A somewhat tall man and a shorter man, both looked to be in their 30s and had decent looking and healthy bodies. Smiling at Joseph's words, the aforementioned doctor nodded and snapped his fingers. The people behind Jason and Tyre moved and quickly descended the ladder deep into the crater where the only remaining body lay. To place the first sacrifices, those ladders were made to make it easier. The taller one grabbed the arms while the shorter one grabbed the legs. Both lifted the body at the same time, only letting out a small grunt. As the men lifted the body, the doctor returned his attention to the trio. More specifically to Joseph. Ads by PubFuture. The body will be upstairs in the storage room for better preservation. Tasha is guarding it for that reason so you don't have to worry about anything happening to it. Giving a deep bow, the smile the devil wore threatened to split his face in half. It is a true pleasure to work with you. My lord. The devil turned to look at the duo who were hoisting their well-deserved prize. If anything happens to him, you will spend an afternoon with me. The ones carrying the body, who were still climbing the long and almost endless stairs, visibly trembled, and the one carrying the legs tightened his grip a little more. Understood, sir. Watching as he finished climbing the stairs and they ran towards the only exit of the cavern, Joseph snorted in annoyance. The clear annoyance in the devil caused much amusement to the doctor, who just rolled his eyes and crossing his legs placed his elbow on his knee and rested his cheek in his palm. His eyes focused on the group in front of him. His smile disappeared and now his face was void of all emotion, looking more like a mannequin than a human being. From now on no one can enter here. We will stay here protecting the womb for 20 minutes and then we will leave. Not a second more or less. Understood. The four in front of him nodded with serious faces. The smile returned to the doctor's face. Excellent. Craboom. Hearing the sound of thunder, the smile on the doctor's face grew again. Looks like Lady Saturna is having a good time. Joseph smiled at his master's words, standing behind him with his back straight. His excitement from before reduced to a simple elegant smile. In the sky above the crimson tree, a mighty torrential rain covered the entire top of the leafless tree, accompanied by powerful lightning that roared with fury and power that tried to strike the tree but could not touch it. Powerful winds collided with each other, making a movement like an explosion. And a barely controlled hurricane that was attacking with power an enemy that was dodging everything. Floating in the midst of these and wearing his black robe with the symbol of the Lord of Storms baked into it. Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake clicked his tongue in great annoyance. His mere presence caused his surroundings to feel oppressed. His soft hat swayed aggressively in the wind that surrounded him like a chapel. In front of him, floating and wearing a simple Gothic dance dress and a hat of exaggerated size, was a woman. This woman had fine features and icy blue eyes, a small smile on her blue lips. She had a cold and wicked air about her, her desires easy to see as her Machiavellian smile left nothing to the imagination. Discipline of silence. Saturna cut C King Ace Snake. Elsewhere and a little further away from the tree, a gentle-faced old man who wore a white robe with the symbol of the god of steam and machinery on his chest found himself stopped by someone similar but much more sinister and evil. This is unfortunate, the man muttered as he scratched his somewhat bushy white beard. His target was only a few streets ahead, the huge smoking crater from where the explosion occurred, which subsequently gave birth to the tree. Point 0. He was so close but yet so far away, and the reason for that had horns. In front of him and holding a sword of burning magma was a black-skinned demon, with huge bat wings on his back and black eyes. Eyes that let out a huge mockery as light black smoke emitting pestilence, filth, and curse came out of his mouth. Oh come on, father. We're just getting started, the demon sneered in a deep, inhuman voice. A dark chuckle gurgled in his throat. Quite a bit further away from them, father's team was cut off by undead, werewolves, zombies, and even more of those transformed humans. They found themselves unable to help him. The archbishop only let out a slight sigh as he raised his left hand with an outstretched palm towards the demon. With metallic sounds, his palm opened, revealing a dark metal cannon. Deep within it, a golden light appeared. The demon's smile remained on his face as he placed the magma sword in front of him and blocked the beam of holy light that made his feet sink into the pavement and dragged him back several meters. Without wasting a second, the robe that covered the archbishop's back moved and from it came out more cannons that fired golden missiles towards the demon. The fight between Demon Tuclero and alchemist Horamic Haydn began. St. Samuel Cathedral. Ads by PubFuture. The preparations were finished. The process to activate the sealed artifact was finished, the only thing left was for him to make the final move. No sooner had the earthquake passed and that tree had risen deep in East Borough than Anthony Stevenson had already begun preparations. He could sense that the situation could not ask for anything else, with reports coming in shortly after receiving the Red Gloves couriers standing by in East Borough. He knew this was an emergency. Every second it took meant hundreds more lives lost. The already dim light behind Chain's Gate became practically non-existent in his presence, which seemed to bring the night itself. He would use the terrifying artifact to deal with the tree. He knew that the forces the church currently had would not be enough. mostly focusing on dealing with the monsters that appeared along with the tree and the supposed sightings of Rose School members that were driving everyone away from the tree's base. He planned to use the only Grade 0 artifact that was kept outside the Holy Cathedral. One that only 2 of the upper echelons church knew was kept in the Backland diocese. This artifact carried a Grade 0. The most dangerous grade there is. An artifact so dangerous that when the archbishop in charge had to transfer out of Backland diocese, his memory of it would be erased by artifact 1 to 29. Name classified. Number 17. Grade 0. Extremely dangerous. Warning. This artifact is not an object. It is a living angel. She has the appearance of a beautiful black-haired woman who, despite her beauty, her face showed no emotion, her eyes of the same black as her hair were the same. Despite her youthful appearance, her true age could not be estimated. She did not have the wings described in the canon. From her appearance alone, she looked like an ordinary woman. She doesn't have the ability to think and lost all sentience. Anything that comes close to her will be erased from existence. Through divination and other methods, it is known that they are still alive, but their location is unknown. Currently, 1,806 methods have been tried, all failing. Her area of effect varies constantly. 70 researchers have disappeared because of her. Warning. She cannot be used. This artifact first appeared in the Pale Era of the 4th Epoch. The date, place, and exact location are unknown. Based on the information, she has been used 5 times. The information on artifact 0 to 17 flashed through his head and Anthony Stevenson let out only a faint sigh. With a wave of his hand, the black candles that lit the hallway where 0 to 17 was standing went out. The activation process was complete and she would awaken for the 6th time in history. Quote. But even though the ritual was completed successfully and completely normally, and the artifact should have activated and gone out to deal with the tree 0 to 17 drought in its previous position, without moving a single inch. An aura of tranquility and serenity was coming from her body. The grounded angel, 0 to 17, was still asleep. Quote. Anthony Stevenson, someone with an already considerably advanced age of 130 years. Someone who has been through a lot, including a war and a near affair with a church sister that almost caused him to break his vow of chastity. Someone who anyone who knew him would say was a gentleman and whose mouth was full of wisdom. Someone like that could only say one thing at that moment. Shit. On the way to the warehouse. This bastard is really heavy. The taller man growled at his companion as they continued on their way to the warehouse, with a considerably accelerated pace while being careful not to let go of the body. Gritting his teeth, the shorter one clicked his tongue in annoyance. Shut up, Samuel, and do something. I'm carrying everything here. The one now known as Samuel gritted his teeth and he lifted the body a little more. Yeah, baby girl. Sherwood Borough. Rose Street, Harvest Church. The street where the church was located did not suffer as much from the earthquake, all the buildings were still standing. There were multiple abandoned carriages and it was abnormally empty. But that didn't mean that there wasn't someone outside. Fush. Clop. The sound of wind being cut was followed by the sound of flesh being cut. A body fell to the ground with its head severed, a golden glow coming from the cut site as well as steam. The black eyes and frothing mouth quivered for a few seconds before going completely still. Sasha Strauss didn't waste a second in raising her golden sword and blocking the claws of another monster that tried to attack her from behind. Snarling, she delivered a powerful kick to the monster's knee, and with a resounding crack, the monster fell to the ground on one knee and the pugilist didn't miss the opportunity and cut its head off with her sword. Is this a nightmare? If so, I want to wake up. The giant thought heavily while with her free hand, she wiped the blood that splashed her cheek. Her green eyes stared at everything with a complicated look. Around her were the bodies of 3 of those things. They all looked human in appearance, but their skin was red and black veins covered their entire bodies. The large claws and black eyes almost made her think they were actually demons, not humans. Looking at the black eyes of the monsters he killed, Sasha could only let out a long, heavy sigh. This was easily the worst disaster she had ever dealt with. Not even the mess with the demoness set came close to this. She wasn't dumb, she knew that what she killed wasn't always a monster. Her eyes moved to one wearing the remains of a simple brown dress full of dust and blood, with multiple patches and seams, proof that the owner extended the life of the dress as much as possible. She noticed the effort the woman put into these, even the progress in each seam. This woman had a life before, a life that ended at her hands after she became a monster and lost all reason. Is this what corruption can do to the human body? Sasha was no stranger to corruption. Her time in the Church of the God of Combat and her own boss warned her multiple times of the danger of corruption or a Beyonder losing control. So she already thought she had an idea of what she might encounter if she ever came across one. Her eyes moved to the empty black eyes of the converted human she killed. Even though he was dead, she could still feel the gaping chasm in them wanting to devour her. Seeing that chasm, Sasha closed her eyes for a moment and let out a heavy sigh. The boss's words echoed in her heart in a loud rumble that now took on a deeper meaning. Glancing behind her back, Sasha saw how the giant was covering the sinister broadsword with a robe as he towered to his mountain height. Around him and surrounding him in a circle of blood, 12 of those monsters lay dead. Unlike her, who tried to make the quickest and most humane deaths possible, either by severing the head or piercing the heart, it seemed that the father did not have the same dilemma. Dismembered bodies, arms, legs, and necks split in inhuman ways, pulps for heads. Father had made a complete butchery and didn't seem to care in the least, even though he surely also knew what these things once were. Sasha could hardly believe her eyes. How could such a gentle father be capable of such brutality? Sasha discreetly moved closer to Charlotte, who had just finished off one of the transformed humans by breaking its neck with a skillful kick. Her green eyes never left the father. What a beast! A loud sigh sounded behind her, followed by somewhat agitated breaths. Those were the last ones, weren't they? How many more of those things will come? Charlotte grunted as sweat poured from his forehead. His charms were running out fast and he only had 3 sun charms left, which so far were by far the most effective against those things aside from Sasha's new sword. Thanks to the melee scholar's potion, his body became stronger and more adept at hand-to-hand combat, but he didn't have any experience. Just because he has become more adept at combat doesn't mean he knows how to fight. Something that became very clear in his usual sparring with the annoying noblewoman who once again broke his nose. All the potion had done was make him learn to fight faster. Utravsky turned around and looked at the melee scholar with an emotionless stare, seriously discomforting the young man who took an unconscious step back. Charlotte tightened the charms in his hands and prepared himself. His spirituality was whispering several warnings, so he kept his movements slow, and discreetly moved his foot a few centimeters to the left, closer to his teammate's back. Sasha, for her part, looked with serious eyes at the father. Her grip on the golden sword strengthened and the holy glow coming from it increased slightly. A loud sigh sounded and the father closed his eyes for a few moments, breathing in and out several times. He opened them again. Emotions returned, but you could tell the man was tense. Sorry about that, young man. Using this broadsword always makes me tense. The father apologized with a deep bow that looked somewhat bizarre for its size. It was as if a thick oak tree would bend 90 degrees and then return to normal. Sasha just nodded and loosened her grip a bit, the sword ceasing to glow. Charlotte took a little longer, but he lowered his charms as well and let out a huge sigh of relief. If we got into a fight, I doubt we would have lasted more than 12 seconds. He thought as nervous sweat trickled down his neck. The father looked around him and then up at the black sky. His eyes, which had madness dancing in the depths of them, finally focused on the massive tree in the distance. It's time. Straightening up, Utravsky turned and walked towards the church. Ads by PubFuture. I'll be back in a moment. Huh, Charlotte exclaimed incredulously, his jaw hanging. At any moment more of those monsters could arrive and their heavyweight wanted to go off to rest, leaving them alone. No, sir. Looking at Sasha, his purple eyes begged for her to say something about it. He wouldn't voice his displeasure to the giant. No thanks. That man easily had 3 heads on him. Better that the one that was closest to his size would take over. It was the most logical decision after all. Sasha, already knowing what Charlotte might be thinking, could only roll her eyes, but she understood the problem. So she was quick to do the logical thing. She walked behind father. Charlotte froze for a few seconds before quickly running after them. Are we done? Sasha asked at father's side, who nodded slightly with his eyes straight ahead. We'll be safe for now. Those monsters won't be back for a long while. How are you so sure? The distrust was clear in Charlotte, who was looking around worriedly. Sasha nodded, sharing the same doubt as her teammate. Without looking at them, father replied, the ones we face could be considered the only monsters in this area. They are not intelligent, but they are not stupid either. They will unconsciously target churches that have a considerable number of people inside or follow the closest smell of blood. That is why so many appeared here. They usually attack in groups, so if they didn't show up anymore with the previous ones, then they are somewhere else. This isn't the first time you've dealt with this. Sasha was surprised. It was already undeniable that father did have experience in whatever was going on. There was a similar case almost 22 years ago now. Much smaller, just taking over a village. It happened during my early days in the church. There were no survivors. Father's eyes darkened, almost as if he could see that tragic September night again. We are doomed. Charlotte's head hung in disgrace. The young man's words earned him a zap from Sasha, who gave him an annoyed look. Get a grip. Quote. Yes, ma'am. Ignoring the scene behind him and without another word, the strange trio entered the church, earning the gaze of all present. Unlike the usual, which would be only one or two believers who couldn't add up to more than 3 at a time, this time the church was almost bursting at the seams. The benches were moved to give more space in the middle, which was where numerous people were lying on blankets. All of them had serious injuries from the earthquake or the monsters that followed, either broken bones or bruises or cuts from claws or broken glass. Opera was wearing a mask, her hair covered by a simple batana. She had armor on, but this was covered by a robe. Her crimson eyes focused on her work at hand, which was to fit a woman's arm into place. Next to her and wiping the forehead of another wounded man with a wet handkerchief was Jerry, who was also wearing a mask and gown. Sheathing the golden sword on her back and making sure the door to the church was locked, Sasha went to help Opera, followed by Charlotte, who didn't want to stay near Father. Father Yutravsky. A young and extremely familiar voice sounded next to the giant, who looked down and smiled gently. What is it, Mantis? Mantis, the girl with brown hair and a few freckles on her nose, squeezed the multi-patched teddy bear closer to her chest and looked behind her, towards one of the blankets where a woman very similar to her, only older, was resting. That woman was B, her mother. Will my mommy be okay? Looking at the sleeping woman who had a bandage covering her head, Yutravsky returned his attention to Mantis and gently stroked her head. Mother Earth always takes care of her children. As long as our time does not come, no plague or evil can harm us. Your mother still has a lot of growing to do, she will be fine. The young girl just nodded, her eyes shining. Thank you, Father. Hugging her father's huge leg for a few seconds, she returned to her mother's side and lay down next to her and hugged her, making sure her teddy bear also hugged her so that she would speed up her recovery. Yutravsky watched this with a small smile before he turned his head in the direction of the hallway. No one else interrupted him. All the other people just looked at the giant's back, but their faces were grateful. Passing by Opera and Jerry, who didn't even turn to look at him but continued with their work of attending to the wounded that were arriving, the father got lost in the hallway and entered the basement. Descending the stairs that were barely illuminated by a few torches, the priest arrived at the considerably large basement that, unlike the other churches, barely housed 3 sealed artifacts. That was not only because of the few artifacts the Earth Mother Church had, but also because of the agreement that had been made with the other churches to avoid conflict, so no sealed artifacts higher than grade 1 were in any of the churches outside of Fainapotter. Quote. Father passed by the various boxes of food and medicine and came to the gray stone wall. He calmly removed the broadsword on his back and placed it on the ground behind him, barely separating his eyes from the wall. That done, and with no other artifact in his possession, the father placed his hand on a specific spot on the wall. The place where he touched his palm glowed for a few seconds before sinking. The stones that made up the wall began to regroup, slowly forming a passage. Ads by PubFuture. With one of the torches he grabbed earlier, the father walked down the new passageway with calm steps and a serene attitude. What was down here in the Harvest Church was something that violated every agreement and promise between the churches not to have a single sealed artifact above grade 1 in these lands. If this were to come to light, Father did not doubt that it could cause a war. Even more so considering that this artifact should be deep within the Holy Church in the Fainapotter Kingdom, not in a small church in Backland. With each step he took and with each step he descended, the information of the artifact deep within the Harvest Church flashed through Yutravsky's mind. Name. Classified. Number. 9. Danger rating. 0. Extremely dangerous. Security clearance. Matriarch. Sealing method. As long as it is near 0 to 9 will remain in an inactive state and do nothing. As long as there is no intention to disturb them, it will be like another piece of furniture and will not attack. Description: this is not an object. This is a living angel. She has the appearance of a very beautiful woman wearing a very ancient dress. No study has been carried out to determine the exact age of it because that would mean interacting in a certain way with. Question mark question mark question mark question mark. Is the strange metal box that 0 to 9 keeps near her at all times. It measures 80 centimeters wide and 120 centimeters high, and its entire body is covered with strange symbols that to date have been impossible to decipher. The very metal it is made of seems to be ordinary iron, but no study has been carried out to confirm this. Since it has been with us, the box has never shown signs of being sentient. At first glance, it looks like a normal metal box. Only once an attempt was made to separate the two, a group of 8 medium and high sequence beyonders, the lowest being 7 and the highest being sequence 4. The entire team of researchers disappeared before they even got within 10 meters of the box. No further attempt has ever been made since. Any researcher who has tried to interact with our divine has died. Each death happened so fast that it was impossible to know what happened to them. The only thing that is known is that there is nothing left of them. Through divination and other methods, it is known that they are all dead. So far, 139 researchers have lost their lives for it. All attempts to divine her origin and that of have been abandoned. The only thing that has been discovered through observations and cross-referencing is that the clothes she wears are very similar to the dresses worn by the ancient sisters in the 4th epic. But her appearance does not match any of the known ancient sisters. She does not possess the ability to think and does not possess sentience. Warning: do not interact in any way with. Data 1. This artifact was given to us by the Earth Mother at the end of the Pale Era. Exact year: unknown. Exact date: unknown. Exact location: Phaenopotter Kingdom. Data 2. The language of the incantation to activate 0 to 9 is unknown. Any attempt to decipher it has been null and void. The only thing known is its correct pronunciation, which only the matriarch knows and only she can teach. Fact 3. She has never been awakened. Data 4. Originally had its own denomination, but after 400 years it was finally discarded. Both the grounded angel and share the denomination 0 to 9, they are considered one being. In addition, has a name but only the matriarch knows what it is. By her recommendation it has been decided to use to refer to the box because according to her own words, it is the most appropriate. Data 5. Only the matriarch can move to 0 to 9 without being eliminated. It is not known if it is because she is an angel or because she is a blessed of Mother Earth. No experiment with beyonders of sequence greater than 3 has been performed. Standing in front of the woman who was still in the same position he last saw her, Utravsky closed his eyes and took a slow breath through his nose. Opening his eyes, he opened his mouth and recited the incantation that would activate the sealed artifact. An incantation whose language he did not know but which 0 to 9 seemed to know perfectly. The herald has incarnate. As soon as the giant said that, an enormous pressure fell on his shoulders that made him stagger and cold sweat began to cover his body. Slowly and as if waking up from a nap of millennia, 0 to 9 opened her eyes to the world. Eyes that were a beautiful crimson that glowed with emotion, enormous emotion. Utravsky was unable to find a word to describe what he was seeing, but all his thoughts froze the next second. Purple-blue lips lifted into a sweet smile that made Father's experienced heart pound, and a small blush adorned his slightly wrinkled face. Even the usual madness in his eyes as well as the respect he commanded disappeared completely, leaving only an embarrassed grandfather who could barely make eye contact and could only stare at the ground like a child talking to his sweetheart for the first time. All sense of struggle within him died and he almost began to play with his fingers. It was as if Father had become a child again. Blissfully unaware of his state, Utravsky would never admit it due to his vow of silence regarding the existence of 0 to 9, but she was by far the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Even though he saw the matriarch, who is considered the most beautiful woman in existence. Before Father could do anything else, a flash of crimson light blinded him for a few seconds and caused him to cover his face with his hands. When he opened his eyes again, he saw how the woman along with the mysterious box had disappeared from the basement, leaving him alone. Inwardly, Father never thought he would feel so disappointed that something would end. Meanwhile elsewhere, in a place where absolute darkness reigned, a place where the concept of light was never born and nothingness reigned as the only sovereign. His eyes opened wide, accompanied by a deep inhale, and then closed tightly, and several harsh growls came out of his throat. The sensation of his soul crackling with the slightest movement was something he did not miss. No doubt he would rather be in the tomato soup and not here. But resigning himself, he gritted his teeth and opened his eyes again. In that absolute darkness, his scarlet eyes glowed like the last embers of a dying campfire. As soon as his mind processed what he was seeing, or rather the lack of it, the man let out a long sigh again. Home sweet home. Adrian Kenway complained in a bitter voice as he looked around, but all he could find was more of that darkness, a darkness he never thought he would see again so soon. Floating in nothingness itself, the redhead found himself smiling in satisfaction. Looks like I won the bet. Hunter's Hallow really pulled it off. Honestly, Adrian couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He was expecting something different, not going back to this void directly. Though I suppose that's a good thing. If I had seen something, who knows what would have happened to me. Mumbling, the red-haired man left the subject for later, his attention returning to his surroundings. Nothingness itself is his only companion. Unlike before, he couldn't sense something familiar here. Hunter's Hallow was not present. It may be that the tunic functions as a sort of bridge between my body and soul. Every time I die, it takes care that my soul has a path to travel so I can return. Adrian felt that this was a part of the truth, but he also felt that something was slipping away from him, as if he was forgetting something important. His whole body tensed, and despite the great pain he was feeling, the cold sweat that ran down his back was so clear and present that he thought that the cold hand of death was touching him. He felt that he had forgotten something extremely important. This alarmed him greatly. Now that he thought about it, he could feel a huge void in his mind that was not there before. It was as if all that information had been erased, but he knew, or at least felt he knew, that it was there before. Letting out a shaky sigh and inhaling slowly, Adrian regained his composure. Now he couldn't lose his cool, he had to keep a clear head if he wanted to find his body. Shaking his head, he would leave that for later. Just because now it didn't seem to present any danger to him, and very much against what he would have wished, he allowed himself to let the subject go a little. Not without first burning it into his mind, for as soon as all this was over, he would spend the next few days in the City of Calamities to think and try to discover what he had forgotten. And if he hadn't forgotten something else. Looking around and seeing nothing, the red-haired man snorted ungraciously and spoke mockingly. At least you could have prepared a party for me, you know. And the balloons, confetti, and candles. Where's my welcome back, idiot, cake? Or you didn't miss me? The feeling is mutual then, you wretches. Adrian self-deprecatingly laughed hollowly. The only response from the void was nothingness itself, not even any echo. Adrian didn't even think he heard his own voice, it was more like he was talking in his head than with his mouth. Shaking the aforementioned and taking the direction that his instinct and spirituality told him, the red-haired man began to advance in search of his body. A predatory smile grew on his face, a smile that promised agony, a smile that grew each time he felt his soul break. Just wait for me to come back, you sons of bitches. I will return every blow, cut, broken bone, severed limb multiplied by 1,000. I will tear your bodies apart to such an extent that you could no longer be considered human. The red-haired man exclaimed madly, no longer just shaking from the cracks in his soul that he was unable to see but was sure were there, but from the anger and hatred he felt towards those who tortured and murdered him. Before he could continue thinking of the 76th way to remove the head of a certain batsman, a great and sudden sharp pain clouded his mind, and Adrian could only let out a grunt and stop himself while holding a hand to his chest in an attempt to stop the pain, but failing for obvious reasons, so that movement was only a mere consolation for him. After a few seconds, the pain became more bearable and he was able to sigh shakily. Okay, no talking. Gritting his teeth, Adrian resumed his swim with determination in his eyes. Fighting against the enormous pain that caused him to move his body, or rather soul, he moved forward. With nothing to do and with only an absolute emptiness surrounding him, Adrian focused one part of his mind on what was going on outside while the other large part was focused on finding any trace of his body. This could also help him ignore the sensation of his own being slowly but extremely painfully breaking apart. The first thing he thought of was the most important thing to him. What happened after he died? Whatever happened in the world of the living, I'm sure it was horrible. With that amount of sacrifices, I doubt that whatever happened after I died was anything but disastrous. Audrian knew that they hadn't just sacrificed him to add another number to the already huge casualty count. No, he knew that they had most likely used his death as a kind of trigger, a switch for something. He didn't doubt this because of what the doctor had called him. Herald of the Hunt. It was strange, that name felt right. It was something he couldn't help but feel that it referred to him and him alone. But at the same time, it also bothered him quite a bit that the one who called him that was that unhappy dick-eating pervert. That pillar. I'm sure it's somehow related to the bastard. Something left behind by them. Maybe they used my death to activate it. Audrian resisted the urge to shake his head to avoid further cracking his soul, so he opted for an inaudible click of his tongue. Every time he looked deeper into what had happened to him, it looked worse and worse, to the point that he did not doubt that a disaster was what awaited him when he opened his eyes. A possible artifact of a being capable of ripping him from his world and bringing him here. He didn't want to imagine what happened after he died, but he knew he would have to face it soon. A sense of great guilt began to settle over him, crushing his heart and threatening to take his breath away. How many people had died? What had happened? Would his team be all right? Would the people he knew be okay? Gritting his teeth to the point where he was sure that if he continued in his would make the veins in his neck burst, Audrian let out a deep, bitter sigh that sounded more like that of a tired grandfather. No longer holding back, he slowly shook his head. The sharp pain worked like a cream for him at this point. No, there's nothing I can do about it. Whatever awaits me when I wake up, I'll face it as I always have. With my eyes up, a gallant smile and a fiery hook. Letting out a slight inward chuckle that barely and hardly made him laugh, Audrian's mind wandered to the people he knew. I don't think you have to worry so much about Teacher Isengard. He's the one from the pathway of the eggheads. I'm sure he'll know how to take care of himself. Dismissing his teacher, the redhead's mind went to his team and he couldn't help but smile a little proudly. They are smart cookies. I'm sure they related the information I gave them to the monarch's warning. I just would have liked to send a longer message than those few words, but I'm sure Joseph wouldn't have let me. One can only pretend to be unconscious for so long while being tortured. Audrian tried to look on the bright side of his recreation time with Joseph, and that was when he discovered that he could safely enter the City of Calamities. That was wonderful, as he had stored there several changes of clothes he would need once revived, and several tools including the artifacts he didn't have on him when he was ambushed. Thinking about what he lost, Audrian couldn't help but curse with venom in the bottom of his heart. He had an idea of how it could have happened. The little information he had gave him a picture of the painting that was quickly filling with red and black colors. He knew he had them before he went through the door, and when he came out they were gone, and also how they went crazy when that door appeared and stopped working. He also couldn't forget what that door did to the people who came in. Maybe whatever transformed those people into those piles of flesh could have also transformed the artifacts on me into characteristics directly. It wouldn't be too crazy to think that, considering what a flesh door means in this world. TCH, Audrian clicked his tongue in annoyance at the thought of a possibility. Maybe even my artifacts are underneath that pile of human flesh, only now they'd just be rocks or some kind of weird slime. Considering how the ambush had been planned and how the doctor looked like someone careful and meticulous, Audrian felt that was what happened. They used a foolish wretch to activate that strange charm that trapped him while disabling and destroying his sealed artifacts, which in turn moved him to the ambush site, leaving him with no way out and no chance of escape even if he dodged the first surprise attack. Nor could he forget Hunter's Hallow's words that someone had beaten it. Perhaps it was too late to save the artifacts when the robe awoke. Congratulations, Doctor, you got a 10 out of 10 on your grade. Come pick up your little star. Audrian could only growl bitterly at that. His heart heavy, and he couldn't help but feel somewhat sad and very frustrated. He lost the burnt band, an artifact that had been with him for a long time and was by far his favorite. Vecchio Pomodoro, an artifact that literally gave him extra lives and was almost priceless to High. The only reason he would ever get rid of the glove would be to transform it into characteristics for Nathan. And the worst thing by far was that he also lost the damn creeping hunger. If Klein knew I lost his beloved, he'd kill me. What the fuck? How could I lose creeping hunger? I'm an idiot. One of the most powerful artifacts in the original history and a fan favorite, including his own, was lost because of stupidity. If he wasn't in this situation, he would cut off his own hand for such a resounding failure. The only consolation he had was that he didn't have hangover time on him when it happened. Letting out another inward sigh, Adrian focused his gaze to the front, or what he at least thought was the front, and continued to move forward. But that doesn't matter anymore. What's done is done. Sasha, Charlotte, and Hazel. They should be safe, but there's someone who isn't. No matter what happens here, I have to hurry and find my body. Right now there was someone who needed him urgently, and it wasn't any of the members of his team. Even though he already considered her an important member of it, no matter how much that old woman wanted to deny it. Wait for me, Flora. I'm coming. He would deal with the widower Klein, the burial of his toys, and whatever it was that awakened after his death later. He now had to save his beloved, and extremely perverted, Miss Worm. Some unknown distance in front of him, a bright flash appeared. So distant that it looked like a star in the night sky. Seeing this, Adrian's lips rose in a sharp smile. Bingo! He recognized that glow. He had found his body. Without wasting a single second and gritting his teeth, he sped up his swim. His soul protested, sending out waves and waves of pain. Every time he moved forward, he could feel everything in his being creaking and cracking. Grr! Groaning through the pain, Adrian just focused all his attention on the star that was getting bigger and brighter, his soul threatening to split apart. After what the redhead felt like an eternity, he managed to reach his body, and the smile that was on his face disappeared and turned into a scowl. Single quote. I look like a boiled tomato. Noticing the similarity to the fruit, the redhead could only think that Miss Worm's nickname was pretty accurate at the moment. Ads by PubFuture. His gaze then lowered to the swollen belly on his body, his expression showing complete disgust and enormous revulsion. He even recoiled a little at what he saw. Don't tell me I'm pregnant. Shit. Ojojo, I'm going to kill them. I'm going to kill them. Oh ho ho, he would take his time, his sweet time. He would do it slow, or so sweetly slow. How dare those sewer rats leave him like that? If those bastards think he's going to give birth, then. Before his mind could go to scenarios involving babies or men giving birth, Adrian hit his chest, hard. His mind clouded over and he was sure he screamed, but the pain managed to snap him out of his panic attack and he couldn't help but let out a long, heavy sigh. Closing his eyes, he took a few seconds to gather his courage. Opening them again, the disgust and revulsion clear still in them, Adrian took a better look at his body. The more he looked, the more his expression relaxed and he could feel himself getting calmer. Single quote. It doesn't seem like the description in the original story of what one looks like after being affected by the divine whore's corruption. He didn't see the exaggerated belly one would expect from a woman 9 months pregnant, so Adrian took it as a wonderful sign. It looks like it was a false alarm. That belly, I think it's more because of all that blood I swallowed. As soon as I revive and find the opportunity, I'll take the morning after pill. The redhead wasn't planning on taking any chances and having a xenomorph come out of his stomach, so he planned to take preventative measures. Preventive measures translated to performing a thorough purification with the City of Calamities and Talk Millennium. If he found anything, he would not hesitate for a second and would gladly abort it. I may have been a bit against it in my previous life, but now. Oh ho ho, pass me the hanger, sister. Regretting his previous decisions, Adrian only let out a sigh and looked at the swollen eyes of his corpse. Unable to help himself, his gaze went up to her bald head and a chuckle escaped him. What could he say? Bald people were always funny to him, whether he was one of them. I always thought if my hair started receding I was going to shave it all off. Shaking his head, and lamenting the knee-headed people, Adrian extended his arm towards his body. This is the worst part. Preparing for what was to come, the redhead wasted no time and touched his body. The effect was almost immediate. The black void began to boil at the same time as an illusory white light began to glow from where he touched his body. Adrian gritted his teeth as the light grew stronger and stronger, removing the darkness that enveloped his entire body, leaving him to see the familiar black cracks. His soul wanted to break, he could feel it, how his soul was breaking and separating, but the white light was forcing it to hold together. He felt as if millions of needles were piercing his body to the bone, breaking and moving it to try to accommodate them in places they shouldn't, but these broken bones refused and went back to their original place and repaired themselves. Also that not a millisecond later the process would repeat itself, only this time worse. So on and on and on, growing in pain along with the light that already almost blinded him. Like the last time he was here, Adrian, all he could do was scream from the agony. Ah! Thus with his pain, the light peaked and engulfed him and his body. Unlike the last time he was here, this time no voices or images were popping into his head. There was nothing. ... Is this the famous fire mage? Asked a woman with short black hair and eyes full of dark thoughts. The one and only. Samuel looked at the woman with sweat pouring from his forehead, not only from the temperature but from carrying the corpse all the way here running. He along with his partner were exhausted. The woman looked deeply at the body. After a few seconds she snorted and turned away from the door, giving free way. It's a shame he's like this. I would have loved to see him when he didn't look like a newborn. Everyone says he was quite a sight for the eyes. Samuel snorted at that. Well, you missed him. Now he'll become one of Mr. Joseph's toys until he gets tired of it and eats it or throws it away. Considering how he's been looking at us, I bet he eats it. Her companion, Clerico, commented as he held the corpse's armpits. Shaking her head, the woman just looked at them with annoyance. Just do what you came here to do and get the hell out of here. The warehouse is empty, so you can dump him anywhere you want. I think there was a blanket over there that was left over, put it on that. You don't want Mr. Joseph to find his new toy on the dirty floor, do you? Nodding somewhat palely, the men walked through the door, and as the woman said, everything was empty. The materials and ingredients that had been used had been taken out several days ago in preparation for today, leaving only a few oil lamps that barely illuminated anything, so the only thing that would be in the warehouse would be the corpse they were carrying. Finding the blanket, the woman said, which was a thick wine-colored cloth, the men walked over to it and began to lower their load. Gently, gently. I don't want to spend a recess with Mr. Joseph because you weren't careful with his things. Samuel grunted as they carefully lowered said object, their movements slow and careful, making sure not to damage it. Clerico could only nod. Normally he would have insulted the worthless man, but now he was too focused on his current job. If something were to happen to Mr. Joseph's things, what would await them would only be comparable to what the man did to the fire mage. Even more so considering that the latter spent all his time annoying and tormenting the man who was torturing him. They only knew it because the doctor told them everything when he returned from healing the mage. That's why they refused to make a single mistake. Bump. Clerico, who was clutching the corpse's armpits so his hands were in some contact with the corpse's chest, paused his descent for a second, frozen and wide-eyed, unsure of what had just happened. His eyes fell on the body with some shock. He thought he felt something that a corpse shouldn't have, but believing it was a game of his imagination, he let it go. Shaking his head and ignoring the good-for-nothing, they almost finished lowering the corpse onto the blanket, and he couldn't help but let out a chuckle. He almost thought he had felt a pulse. That almost made him shit his pants. It had been a long day. After all, it was obvious he would start imagining things. Bump bump. Clearer this time, so clear to the point he could feel it. The man's eyes twitched and his already pale skin paled even more. Shit. With a scream of horror that sounded more like that of a little girl than a man of 30, Clerico dropped the corpse to the ground as he jumped backwards. In his haste to get away, he ended up tripping and falling to the ground with pure horror on his face. Samuel watched in shock and an equal degree of terror as the body's head hit the ground with a thud. Shock and terror quickly turned to fury as he swiftly placed his legs on the ground and walked with heavy steps toward his idiot partner. What the fuck is wrong with you? You want to die that much? Samuel roared in Clerico's face as he grabbed him by the neck hard, his back to his body. Ha 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 ha, trouble in paradise, Samuel. Ah ha 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 ha. The woman's voice sounded behind the door, clearly pleased with what was going on inside. Shut up, Tasha. Samuel roared at the door but only succeeded in making the woman laugh louder. Clerico tried to say something but his grinded and dirty mind could not find the right words. His sight at no time left the body. A body that began to shake and whose swollen red skin began to steam. Broken red skin was falling off, peeling off like old paint, leaving a layer of the red muscle that was quickly being covered by healthy white skin. What's going on? Wasn't he dead? Every thought process he was going through, every excuse he was trying to make. It all died when he saw how the already healthy arm of the one that already looked more human trembled slightly. Is he even human? He should alert his partner, and warn him of what was going on behind him. Behind? Behind. What he wanted to shout. It only came out as faint murmurs, barely able to send the message he so desperately wanted to give. Mumbles that were easily silenced by his partner's shouts and Tasha's laughter from outside. What the fuck do you think will happen if Mr. Joseph's property gets damaged, huh? We'll be his new property. So loudly he was shouting, Samuel was bathing his face in saliva, but he didn't care, his eyes were still glued behind him. Plap. No longer able to stand being ignored, Samuel slapped the man hard and he continued to not look at him. With veins throbbing in his neck, Samuel moved so close that their noses were almost touching. Look at me when I'm talking to you, you bastard. Your voice is really annoying. Quote exclamation mark quote. Every word that was going to come out of her mouth died the instant her heart seemed to stop beating. A hot breath on the back of his neck and a voice so cold it made his blood freeze and he felt his limbs drop. There was only one person who made him like this every time he spoke. Mr. Joseph. No. That's not his voice. With the new clarity, his mind returned to normal. At first he thought it was the demon coming to check on the state of his treasure, but the voice now lacked the raspiness of the demon's. This voice was thick, somewhat deep, clearly that of a man, but you could still hear the youth in it. It had a tautness that made her hair stand on end and an edge that caused a chill to run up his back. It was a completely different voice than Mr. Joseph's. Ads by PubFuture. This was an unfamiliar voice. But with that clarity he could see perfectly his companion's face, and that made his hands start to shake. The madness of being a lunatic made it take him too long to notice that his companion was catatonic and that at all times he was looking behind him with the greatest of fears plastered on his face. Clerico's face grew paler and paler, he even began to tremble, his mouth hanging as if it were broken. Huge tears streamed down his face. It looked like he had seen death. Samuel tried to turn and connect a blow to whatever was behind him, but that was faster. Before he could even turn his head, a powerful fist of fire shot through his chest, destroying his heart, while another hand grabbed his head and twisted with the force of a bull. Crack. Clerico was in shock. He just stared with blurred eyes at the monster that had just killed his companion. Rising to a height of 1.85 meters, long vibrant red hair like flames covered his head and ended up framing his face, giving him a savage look. His face that previously had puffy eyes, cheeks, lips, and ears now lacked that hideous and repulsive appearance. Sharp and savage features, but which at the same time were soft and smooth, plump and pink lips. Most of his once red and swollen body was now a healthy pale, the few remaining red patches were shrinking rapidly. The former swollen flesh had returned to the prominent, marked musculature of a hunter, his plump belly returning to a marked abdomen. The rumors weren't lying when they said he was quite a sight for sore eyes. But for Clerico, he wasn't seeing the naked beauty in front of him. No. All his attention was upstairs. The reason he felt he couldn't move and felt his mind go blank was because of those two glowing orbs. Those were the eyes of a raging predator, a hungry beast, eyes that weren't even looking at him but staring at the door. He was not worthy to be the one to satiate their hunger. Scarlet eyes that glowed with such intensity, he was sure they burned as brightly as the blazing fire that covered his hand. Before he could realize it, the same fist that killed his partner and was still piercing him grabbed him by the neck, and before he could scream from the flames that burned his neck and ate away at his flesh. Crack. Still with his arm plunged into the man's chest, he lowered them carefully, his eyes always on the door where a woman's laughter came from. Depositing the bodies on the floor and pulling his blood-covered arm out of the man's chest, the red-haired man fell to his knees to the side. His cheeks swelling rapidly. Bluff. A hot crimson torrent came out of his mouth with force. The man made no effort to contain it any longer and let it all out while trying to make as little noise as possible. A difficult thing to do, as what seemed to be gallons and gallons of what seemed to be liters and liters were shooting out under pressure from inside him. Huff huff. After vomiting for what seemed like an eternity and being somewhat agitated, he wiped his mouth with his wrist. An expression of utter disgust on his face. That tasted horrible. That blood was by far the worst thing he had ever tasted. There was no way the taste would go away for months, and he seriously doubted he could forget it. The woman outside was still laughing loudly, so he could take a few seconds to calm his headache. I was planning to throw you a party in celebration, but it looks like you've had enough glasses of wine. A familiar voice spoke inside him, and the man could only let out a quiet chuckle. It tastes horrible, and I don't think someone your age can handle it. But don't worry, I'll make you some grape mush so you can play with the young ones. Responding back in a raspy and extremely low voice, the man couldn't help but give a smile as he heard the annoyed grunt inside him, inwardly relieved that she was okay. After a few seconds of grunting, she let out a sigh of relief. You're still you. Welcome back, princess. Sorry for the delay, Miss Worm. Traffic in hell is horrible. Adrian Kenway smirked as he looked at his blood-covered arm with curiosity and some surprise in his eyes. My spirituality was practically empty when I died, but when I was resurrected it filled up instantly, and not only that. The spirituality I spent on that little attack filled up faster than I spent it. When I first died I was sequence 8, so I couldn't notice the difference that much. But now that I am sequence 7 digested I can notice it. Noting these effects for a review, Adrian lowered his hand with his eyes already focused on the door. She's the last one left. I can't hear anyone else. The red-haired man thought for 5 seconds and shook his head, grabbing the legs of the bodies. He was going to drag them away and hide them, but his sight focused on the wine-colored sheet. Right now I'm invisible, I can't lose that. Unknown number of enemies in another unknown place. Fighting would be like screaming at the top of my lungs that I'm still alive. That necrophilia bastard said I'd be his when this was over. I'm no longer at the lake, so I can assume this is where he was going to keep me. Looking down at the men he killed, an annoyed look blossomed at the sight of the taller of the two. A few centimeters shorter, but it should suffice. Releasing the shorter body, he quickly dragged the taller one to the sheet he came and placed it on. Without wasting another second, he grabbed the thing's pants belt and began to remove it with a flat stare. Princess, I don't want to walk around with my spear in the air all day. He doesn't need them anymore anyway, so why not take advantage and wear them right? Immediately cutting the worm off and not being in the mood to deal with it, Adrian whispered. He was proud of his body, but he was getting tired of walking around all day in his birth suit. He wasn't a pervert who enjoyed that. Quote. It's a good idea, after all a princess must keep her purity, right? Flora replied calmly, internally disappointed. Rolling his eyes at the old woman's words, Adrian pulled on his pants and could only groan internally at how tight they were and didn't leave much to the imagination. He was sure that if he did a squat or lifted one leg too much they would tear. The disadvantage of having big legs. Shaking his head, Adrian quickly went back to his work and removed the rest of the man's clothes. The shirt and vest were placed under the body. They were too small for him, so he had no choice but to discard them. That done, Adrian quickly grabbed the edge of the sheet and covered the body. Knowing he had no more time, he moved with speed and silent steps to a dark corner where the lamps did not illuminate well and threw the remaining body there. His eyes then moved around and he could only grunt. He had noticed two things as he was moving. First, this place was once used as a warehouse, and second, he didn't see any way out. So if he wanted to get out he had to use the door that these two little songbirds came in. Bang! Bang! The sound of the door being slammed made Adrian immediately go on guard. His fists caught fire. The door handle was then pulled down, but the door did not open. Hey, did you guys finish putting away that sack of meat? Or are you fucking now? I'll give you 2 seconds and you better hope that when I open this door you guys have your pants up. Quickly considering his options and what he had on hand, Adrian clicked his tongue in annoyance. He was at the back of the warehouse and there was no way he was going to make it in time before the door was opened. There was no place to hide either. Without further delay, he extended his left hand to the front, and from the flames a bow of fire was formed. Extending the string and forming a fiery arrow that quickly turned to burn white, Adrian extended his senses and pointed to where he heard the woman was. The likelihood of her being a sequence higher than 7 is extremely low. Guarding an empty storeroom doesn't take a lot of force, if anything a sequence 8 meander to keep anything from getting back in here. Using a lot of force on something that is no longer useful would be a waste. So I can rule out that woman being a wraith or zombie. Also that she is a devil. There is too much emotion in her voice and I can't sense that lack of humanity. So at most, she is a lunatic, and if I'm unlucky she would be a werewolf and this attack may not kill her in one hit. Sure, this will no doubt draw everyone to the party. That would be if I explode the arrow, but if I just condense the power and contain it that won't happen. If anything, the only thing that could happen is that the body will be torn apart and I'll have to hide it in pieces. I'll finish this quickly. By the time anyone comes I'll be gone. With sharp eyes, he prepared to release the arrow. Foosh. The temperature in the room suddenly dropped and Adrian found himself capable of looking at his breath. A familiar presence made itself known and the red-haired man turned his head as the bird's skull embedded itself in the bone door and it opened revealing the fog he was so familiar with. Chicho. The red-haired man muttered in disbelief, the bow of fire in his hand disappeared and all his attention was focused on the bone door. Before he could say anything else and contrary to his expectations, a hand came out of the door and faster than he could blink grabbed his arm. Adrian was quickly pulled into the bone door at the same time the warehouse door was opened. Listen you wretches better keep your you that's cold. Tasha entered with a furious step but upon seeing the empty warehouse she was unable to withstand the shiver that went up her body. This immediately alerted her and she stood on guard, pulling a revolver from her belt and looking around. She could only see a body covered by the sheet but failed to find the two imbeciles who entered. This only alerted her further. Taking a step back, Tasha turned around intending to leave the warehouse and sound the alarm but she froze. Standing in the doorway and outrunning her by several heads was an enormous bird whose body was composed entirely of white, slightly cracked bones, a thin skull that was staring at her with its empty sockets in which floated cold white flames that seemed to dance in a wind that wasn't there. Tasha didn't even have time to blink. Thud. The sound of a body falling to the floor echoed in the storeroom whose door was slowly closing. The only thing that filled it was a naked body, a body with a broken neck, and a skeleton without a head. Adrian's world turned upside down, his head ached and his vision became blurry and turbulent. A constant hammering in his mind made it hard to think and a sense of emptiness was all he could feel. He could have sworn Flora was saying something but in his current state, she was nothing more than the wind rushing past his ear. Through his blurred vision and dazed mind, Adrian could see with some difficulty how he was moving through what appeared to be a door of white light. This door was moving through a strange world, although it was unknown to him, he knew what it was. The spirit world, a place full of mysteries, where information from the past, present and future was and even interacted with each other. Where directions were indistinguishable from each other. Where the gray fog reached far beyond what any eye could see and completely covered this world, like an endless ocean that contained the secrets of this world. At the top, although here directions didn't matter as one could not be guided by the logic of the physical world where one would think was the ceiling as above it was just more of the mysterious and almost omnipresent gray mist were 7 rays of light consisting of red, orange, yellow, blue, green, indigo and violet. Rays that went beyond what the eye could see. His messenger was grabbing his arm and dragging him through this world. Because of her position, he could not see her expression, all he could see was her raven black hair moving slightly. The next second and in front of them he saw a door of bright light form. Suddenly, as if it had all been an illusion in a desert, everything returned to normal and Adrian found himself looking back at the familiar rocky wall. It seemed that they were still in the cave system from before. For a second, Adrian felt his vision blur. Princess, what's wrong? Are you alright? What the fuck is wrong with you talk? Flora's roar of fury and concern rumbled in his mind and Adrian finally realized he was on his knees, his hands on the ground. Huh, the redhead muttered completely stunned, his jaw quivering and it wasn't just that, his whole body was the same, shaking violently, covered in sweat, and extremely pale, as if he was experiencing the worst of colds. His mind was barely processing his surroundings but he could feel a huge hand on his back and how someone was kneeling beside him. He could feel a gaze on him, sure to be from his messenger. Opening his mouth but failing to find the words to say something at the same time he was unable to say anything, he could only close it again and tried to catch his breath. But Adrian no matter how much he wanted to breathe he could not, his body did not respond and a horrible feeling of absolute terror gripped him completely as an anaconda choked and crushed its prey by suffocating them with its massive body. His mind threatened to follow his body but his will kept it there. What's wrong with me? What is this? Thinking those words took a lot more work than he thought possible. His skin slowly began to release a little steam as light flames began to dance in his fingers. Princess, go into cogitation. If you continue like this you will lose control. Flora's strong but at the same time soft voice pierced the darkness that was clouding his judgment and Adrian barely gave a very weak, almost imperceptible, nod of his head. Closing his eyes, he tried to empty his mind and slowly began to form the sphere of light. Like grains falling from an hourglass, Adrian felt the control of his body slowly return. The hand on his back just stayed there, It did not move or try to comfort him but stayed there as a companion trying to say, I am here. After 2 minutes the redhead opened his eyes again and let out a very long sigh and fell lying on the floor. What the fuck was that? Adrian asked no one. Chicho who had sat next to him tilted his head to the side slightly. You tell me, you useless. How can you almost lose control by traveling through the spirit world? Flora was in complete disbelief. She couldn't believe what she had seen. A guy who keeps moving through the shadows while listening to the true creator's ravings as if they were an opera has a panic attack from using the journey. That's ridiculous. Flora wanted to say more but found herself unable to speak. The eyes and expression the red-haired man had had upon leaving the spirit world. It was an expression she never thought she saw on his face, and Flora could only describe it with absolute horror and fear. The Jacob thought as she watched the redhead getting up from the ground as he shook the dirt off of him. Next, let me know when you're going to do something like that, yeah? Adrian asked the giantess, who gave a rough nod as she slowly stood up. It may have been for my soul. Upon resurrection, my soul is in a really sensitive state, so traveling in the spirit world was like an overdose of sugar and caffeine. The red-haired man explained to the air calmly. Your soul. Flora mumbled, not quite believing what the redhead was saying, but she then remembered something. When she tried to parasitize the princess, she was moving through a space full of cracks. That was supposed to be one's spiritual body and thus a mirror to the soul. That makes sense. With such a broken spirit body, it's not uncommon that traveling through the spirit world could be overwhelming. Adrian for his part couldn't help but remember his recreational time with the interrogator. The redhead was inclined to accept that theory. His soul upon revival was something super sensitive. The slightest touch would have him on his knees drooling and groggy. Shaking his head, Adrian licked his dry lips as he clenched his fist tightly to stop his trembling. The episode earlier had him somewhat tense, but he had no time to dwell on that now. Looking into Chicho's pearl eyes, Adrian's expression became expressionless, his eyes shining. While I appreciate your help, Chicho. Why did you come for me? I don't remember ringing the bell. Bell that right now is resting in my chest of calamities. Adrian added in his heart as he waited for the giantess' response. Looking deeply into her contractor's eyes, Chicho lowered her head slightly and spoke in a somewhat low voice. The situation in Backland is horrible. If I could have gotten there sooner, but I couldn't find you. So if I'm in Backland, that's good news and bad news. Adrian wasn't too surprised that Chicho knew it was Backland. A messenger had to know her terrain after all, and she had already sent several messages through the city. It was the norm. The redhead was quite glad that he had been wrong about where he was and that he sent a little warning to his team. But he was also extremely pissed that the ritual in which he had been the final ingredient was done right here. I overestimated too much how far that charm could have taken me. TCH. Burying his annoyance and disappointment inwardly, Adrian frowned and looked deeply into the gray eyes of his messenger. What do you mean the situation in Backland is horrible? I've been a bit indisposed, so I'm not aware of what's going on outside. Chicho nodded, and instead of answering she extended her hand to her right side. There where she was pointing, white bones quickly began to rise up, forming another door. As the classic bird skull embedded itself in the middle, it opened and Adrian found himself unable to breathe, impaling. His eyes clouded over, and the same whispers he heard when he first saw the doctor flared up again, and this time with much more force than before. BURN 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 BURN. What the fuck is that? Flora's disbelieving roar echoed in his head, snapping him out of his trance. Inside the door was an extremely vivid image of an outside view of Backland. With a starless pitch-black sky and a titanic crimson tree that made something deep inside Adrian burn with fury and irritation. The crimson color and that bloody glow it expelled. Not to mention the sheer disgust at the sight of it. The redhead knew they were in serious trouble. Long columns of smoke and forests of fire stretched all over Backland. The area where he was having the worst time was the place from where the blood tree seemed to have emerged. And that was East Borough. So that's what I woke up with my death, huh? Adrian thought, feeling strangely empty. Maybe it was because he still wasn't processing what he was seeing well, or because he was processing it too well. He knew that there were only two things capable of making a tree of those magnitudes, and he was sure that one of those things was on Earth's side. Now that he was seeing the consequences of being caught, Adfian finally got an idea of what the Rose School wanted to accomplish. That pillar maybe was sealing that, keeping it at bay. So Rose School used the people of East Borough as a sacrifice to weaken the bastard's seal. Then they used my death to destroy it completely and release that thing. Or could it be that the bastard hid that thing in that pillar so that it could be used later as a trap card? To give the world a check and facilitate and hasten the demise of this one. The redhead thought he had gotten an idea of what the bastard that brought him here was like, but with the possibility that at some point they might have saved this planet. He felt he didn't really know anything. If we are still alive, then that should mean that the gods were able to contain this disaster. But why I'm not seeing an army of angels destroying that thing is beyond me. Adrian thought emotionlessly as he looked at the image on the door. At least he could tell that the Church of the Angry Pigeon was doing something, if the thunder shower in the treetop was anything to go by. Honestly, Adrian wasn't surprised by what he was seeing. He would even say that it was about time something like this happened. With all the despair, hatred, evil, depravity, pain, etc. that was there, he was just surprised it hadn't happened sooner. He would even say it was a miracle it took so long. The inability and uselessness of the three churches finally combined and created the mother of all consequences. Adrian thought with empty eyes as he looked at the massive tree. His icy eyes moved to Chicho. What did you mean by getting me out of here? Chicho's already cold expression turned icy to the point that Adrian felt as if his soul was freezing. After a few seconds, the messenger replied. The gods have sealed Backland. Taken by surprise by this, Adrian didn't take a second to express his disbelief. What does that bouncer mean by that? Adrian, Flora was panicking, and if she had his body she was sure she would be hyperventilating. God sealing a city. That just meant that whatever the tree was, it was bad enough to make the usually inactive gods move together. Ignoring his companion who was going into a muttering, panicked episode. Adrian looked dumbfounded at his messenger. Explain yourself. If she was annoyed by the bluntness, Chicho hit it like a master, and her already rather expressionless face only added that. Lowering her head slightly, she explained in a soft but deep Elvish. Like that of an experienced warrior telling stories of her battles. Backland was sealed off from the outside world. Not even angels are allowed to enter. The gods made it so that if they failed to contain the corruption that was released here, they could more easily purify it. Hey. The red-haired man's voice descended into dark tones. What Chicho just revealed hit him like a meteorite would a planet. Purify. But it's a whole city. Don't you know how many would die in that? Flora screamed in disbelief. What the gods wanted to do was genocide. Backland, according to the most recent studies, had a population of more than 30 million people. Ads by PubFuture. Purify a city of millions of people. Such a large number made Flora's mind cloud over. She had read events of a similar scale in the family library books, but those were numbers that only appeared in the 4th epic. In the 5th epic, there were no war events that came close to touching even the shadow of the millions, even up to billions in some other books, of dead in the previous epic. Not even the Battle of the Velated Oath, and that war claimed 5 million lives. Adrian also shared those thoughts, but much deeper. The information he had as a transmigrator was showing him the big picture and the consequences that a purification on that scale could bring. Purify is a nice word for when the children ask their parents about why there is a huge bottomless hole in the North Continent and they can say that the gods did a cleanup. The best way, and the correct way, to call it would be complete annihilation. Leave not even the ashes of whatever that tree has touched and miles beyond to ensure its complete destruction and that its foul root has spread no further. Adrian narrowed his eyes at this. I would understand if it were the god of combat and the eternal blazing sun. They would gain much advantage from this disaster, perhaps a little of the god of knowledge and wisdom, but I refuse to accept that Earth Mother, the Evernight goddess, the Lord of Storms and the god of steam and machinery would allow that. Because the former's whole being is about valuing and protecting life, and that amount of lives lost would be ridiculous for her to accept, it would go against who she is. But the last ones are the ones who have the most to lose. Do you seriously think they will be able to sacrifice so many anchors? At this point, Adrian sent the honorifics to the gods to hell. If they had a problem with him not doing the 57 shitty dances to show respect, then send him a bolt of lightning, because right now that could go right to hell. From sequence 2 onwards, one needs anchors to stabilize one's mental condition. The insanity that comes with becoming a full mythic creature and acquiring so much divinity makes one have no choice but to have anchors to maintain their self. There are pathways that can do a bit of cheating for this. Like for example, the error pathway can use the clones of themselves that they can create from sequence 2 as anchors, or even steal them from others in higher sequences by impersonating another being's identity. But even a pathway that was focused on stealing, cheating and manipulating bugs has to have anchors. Even the Raven wasn't spared from that. And it only gets worse each time one moves further into the sequences. The true gods are sequence 0, hence they need a large amount of anchors to maintain their sanity. With Baklan's population and with how rare it is to be a non-believer in this time, Adrian could only compare what would happen to the gods to someone cutting off the legs and arms of a mountaineer in the middle of climbing Everest. They would quickly fall into the abyss and their only salvation would be the harness of the other believers in other parts of the world. But of course, even if they managed to stop their fall into the abyss, that would still leave them in a highly vulnerable state, not only against the evil gods on earth, who would no doubt take the opportunity to finish them off, but to the hungry wolves waiting beyond the barrier protecting this planet. His eyes widened slightly, his eyebrows rising in realization. Adrian could see how the pieces of the puzzle were quickly beginning to fit together, how what had once had him confused was now being shown to him in its true form. This is what the Rose School wanted. An extreme situation that would leave the gods in a horrible state, no matter what they did to avoid it, that would always be the end result. With that, they would only have to worry about the angels and grade 0 artifacts trying to control the situation, but at that point, they would have the advantage in numbers. They would have won. And the apocalypse would come much faster than in the original story. Adrian felt that he had finally seen Rose School's true plans, and he could only shiver from the chills it caused him and clench his fists in fury. Chicho looked deeply into Adrian's icy scarlet eyes. Her expression was just as vacant as a statue. They will have no choice. His messenger's words were ice water to Adrian, like the final nail that only finished off his theory. He gritted his teeth, followed by a deep growl. The red-haired man brought a hand to his face and let out a heavy sigh. After a few seconds he replied. I know. What? Flora was incredulous. The big hero was fine with letting 30 million people be purified. Bullshit. Adrian, think about what you're saying. It's crazy. Are you seriously agreeing to this? Not wanting to cause any misunderstanding or confusion, Adrian allowed himself to give a short explanation, not caring that his messenger was watching him talking to himself. Flora, believe me when I say that I am repulsed by what the gods plan to do, but trust me. If you knew what was really going on, you would know that even though it is extreme, it is the only option. The only option? What could be worse than killing millions? The end of the world. That would be worse. Adrian cut the games short and went for the atomic bomb. Stunned, Flora could only blurt out a stuttering, disbelieving, what? Closing his eyes, Adrian thought for about 3 seconds about his next words. I can't explain due to this information being the worst corruption, but believe me when I tell you. The purification they plan to do may be the only way to stop the end of the world. Being a 200-year-old demigod, adding that she was part of an ancient angel family like the Jacobs. Flora immediately understood what the red-haired man was trying to explain. A loud shuddering sigh sounded inside her head. Adrian could hear and feel how it carried the experience of a long life. Is this what the Scarlet Monarch was referring to? Your goal of preparing a team? At the question, Adrian shook his head. No, I'm preparing them for something worse. This thing that's happening now. It doesn't even touch the horizon of what's coming. When he said that, Flora did not respond. She remained quiet, processing what had just been said. Jacob's mind drifted back to the night when the red-haired man introduced the female named Bug to his team and the Scarlet Monarch's objective. After a long 3 minutes of silence, Flora finally said, worse things are coming, aren't they? Instead of answering and taking a chance at corrupting his little worm, Adrian just nodded. Doubting that his companion would say anything again, the red-haired man returned his attention to his messenger. His expression turned serious and his eyes took on a dangerous gleam. What is your plan, Chicho? If you wanted to get me out of Backland, you would have done it by now. You're after something else. Did she trust what Chicho had shown him? 100%, that primal instinct assured him that it was really happening. Did he trust Chicho's motives? No. He was confident that she wouldn't hurt him because if she had wanted to, she would have already done it. Besides, she had revealed information that made him not take it as a game. Not that he hadn't taken her seriously before, but that little revelation made his messenger move up several notches of danger in his book. You're not a demigod, are you? Adrian asked directly, and Chicho just looked at him. Only an angel or receiving the direct protection of a god would you be able to withstand the corruption of information you seem to possess. So that leads me to believe that you are one, am I correct, Your Excellency? That information brought out Flora, who stared blankly at the 5-plus-meter giantess. So much information revealed in such a short time was making it hard for her to keep up. If she was in her normal state this wouldn't be a problem, but her state was still horrible, so even this amount of information was proving to be too much for her. The princess's messenger is an angel. And not only that, you're part of 2 pathways, the redhead added, oblivious to the state of his cormet. Flora for her part simply turned to stone. Adrian was certain that Chicho was part of the death pathway, the bone gate, and how the temperature always dropped with her arrival was more than enough proof in his books. But the way she moved through the spirit world and that door of light. Of course, he knew that from sequence 5 the Beyonders of the death pathway could move through the spirit world, but the way Chicho had done it was nothing like the way the Beyonders of that pathway did it. Those were unique to the door pathway. As far as I know, the death pathway cannot copy the abilities of other pathways. Not only that, there was a point in history when the death pathway and the door pathway were together. Finally, many things made sense, like how she always found the place to deliver the letters or packages despite vague descriptions, or even the way she sealed creeping hunger with that strange seal. It all pointed to the same being. The same old god. The ancient god of death of the second epoch, the ancestor of the phoenix, Regrace. But she fell when the ancient sun god emerged, so there's no way it's her, surely it's a descendant of her race. Not to mention that she has no mutations or any malformations expected of a being whose times one would swallow any Beyonder ingredient. Not to mention that she seems to retain her sanity quite well. That alone lends further weight to her being only an extremely distant descendant. And most likely the last of the Phoenix. Squinting at his messenger, Adrian asked in a serious voice. What does a descendant of the Phoenix want with me? Snapping out of her stupor a bit, Flora, aside from being stunned, disbelieving, stunned, and mentally blocked, also found herself confused. Phoenix. Like the legendary immortal firebirds. At no time since he started speaking did Chicho's expression change, she just looked at him with a calm and expressionless face as was usual of her. After a long and choking 5 minutes of silence, the supposed Phoenix let out a slight sigh and her expression softened. Her lips lifted into a resigned smile. I had hoped to keep this hidden a little longer. But I'm not disappointed. If anyone could find out who I was, that someone was you. Harold. In a gentle voice in perfect Elvish, Chicho responded by bowing her head slightly with a small lift of her lips. Gone was the strong nod or the inability to show emotion. The change was so brutal that Adrian felt he was seeing 2 completely different people. Recovering, Adrian snorted, it was all an act then. Partly yes and partly no. I love chocolate much more these days, Chicho replied with a subtle smile. At least your sugar addiction is real. Adrian said mockingly as he snorted to the side. Looking back at his messenger, he added, you didn't answer my question. I am your messenger, Harold. I seek neither to harm you nor to wrong you. Chicho said with a serious face, eyebrows furrowed slightly and one hand on her chest. And what I seek? I'm sorry, but you're still too weak to know. I guessed as much. It's never the easy way, right? Adrian rolled his shoulders, already having expected that answer. Chicho tilted her head slightly, looking at him curiously. You're taking this better than I expected, Harold. Ads by PubFuture. Cracking his neck with a resounding plop, Adrian shook his head. Meh, sooner or later I'll end up learning it. If you don't want to tell me now, it's not because of corruption. You know more about me than I expected. Who every great existence that has been on this planet long enough knows about the heralds. The gods are no exception, Chicho commented with a slight chuckle. Clicking his tongue with slight annoyance, Adrian complained, call me Adrian, you calling me by that title at this point is a bit pointless, don't you think? If that is your wish, Lord Adrian, then I hope you keep calling like you did before. Chicho gave a somewhat deep bow as a sign of respect. If it were a better time I would be sure to find out everything you know about the heralds, but now is not the time. Knowing that every second was worth more than gold, as it was one more life lost and he had already gotten the most important thing out of the way, he already faced the main problem. Why didn't you get me out of here if you know how important I am? Chicho's soft expression turned hard. That's why I didn't take you out of here. Because you're a herald. Without waiting for the question she could already come up with, Chicho continued as she pointed to the door still showing the image of the tree. At this rate, it's only a matter of time before the gods level Backland. We cannot allow that. The consequences will be worse than the current situation. His head tilted slightly to one side and he also raised an eyebrow. And how do you want me to deal with that? I'm only sequence 7. I don't have anything in my arsenal that can damage a tree of that size. Besides, aren't you an angel? The only one in Backland like you said. Why don't you go help, or are you afraid? I didn't know my messenger was a coward. My most powerful attack is the plasma beam, but that one takes a long time to charge. Now with the digested potion I can charge it in 15 seconds, but it's still a long time. And the noise caused by compressing it would make it impossible to sneak attack. Despite his harsh words, Adrian wanted to help, but he wasn't an imbecile. The redhead knew when he was outmatched. So why not pass the problem to hands much more capable than his own? Like, for example, an angel. You just insulted an angel, you crazy bastard. Do you want to die so badly? Flora was completely frozen with terror. And it showed in her voice that came out more like a hurt puppy squeal than a scream. Chicho's eye twitched for an instant, clearly not having expected that response. Recovering quickly, she shook her head with her lips showing the tiniest shadows of a smile. But it only lasted a second before her face immediately became serious again. She replied in a deep voice laden with disappointment and helplessness itself. That tree is as if the moon were walking on the earth. The nucleus at its root is like the blood moon. The mere fact that I even come a little close to it would make my fate no different from that of the gate to 1,000 worlds. I've already risked too much by withdrawing you from there. I can't do more than this. And that's just talking about the core. If I go outside, I wouldn't last a second before being wiped out by the night or fulminated by lightning. The Phoenix are not welcome in this new era. Hearing the new information, Adrian looked with a flat face at Chicho. After a few seconds, he gave voice to his softer thoughts as the harsher ones were buried. Quote. Are you telling me that at this instant you are just as useful as a comb to a bald man? Princess. For once in your life, could you try not to provoke someone? Flora roared, trembling. Chicho on her side pursed his lips and gave a weak nod. That would be the best way of comparing it. Yes. Do you at least have a plan? Adrian asked as he put a hand to his face in exasperation. Time was running out and here they were wasting it. Chicho nodded with a serious face, her posture taking on a more dignified and uplifted tone. Adrian unconsciously straightened his back. To finish off that tree, it is necessary to destroy the core. I can't get close, but you can. Wait. Are you forgetting that I'm only sequence 7? I don't have any attacks strong enough to destroy a core. Adrian raised a hand and cut off his messenger, his brow furrowing in restrained annoyance. Cores aren't as strong as the tree, and you don't need to destroy it either. You only need to weaken it. That will give the window to the gods so they can purify it without leveling the city. Chicho quickly explained as the image on the door changed to being a single projection of the tree. This projection went down to its roots. In that projection showed a complex system of caves at the same time as a small red dot where the trunk and root were located, juxtaposed by the huge dome. Adrian assumed it was where the pillar once stood. Much farther away from this, almost on the other side, there was also a white dot. This is us. Chicho pointed to the white dots. This is as close as I can get without being in danger I can't control. If this is to scale, then we are 10 kilometers from the dot. Adrian made a quick mental estimate. Quote. And this is the core. The messenger taped the red dot. This is the weak point of the tree. If anything happens to it, no matter how small a small crack is enough, the whole structure of it will begin to fail. And it will be able to be purified without risking Backland. Staring at the red dot, Adrian frowned, noting the most obvious of problems. Then that core will be more protected than a nun's sanctity. How am I going to get close enough to damage it if I'm busy being demolished by the full force of Rose School? At his clear doubt, Chicho smiled sideways. You won't have to worry about it. It may be impossible for me to get close, but that doesn't mean I can't move you. The white dot flickered off only to reappear in the huge corridor that connected to the core. Is this as close as you can get me? Closest wit. Yes, I know. That she would be corrupted. He already got it right the first time, she didn't need to repeat it. Quote. You have a huge death wish. Flora commented after watching a meander of sequence 7 cut off an angel. Ignoring his worm companion, Adrian looked seriously at the core. How many demigods and angels can I expect in there? Will you be able to get me out of there once I do my part? There won't be any demigods or angels. His head whipped toward the giantess in something of a daze. That core is like the blood moon. Its light makes the divinity of the saints and angels bring life. Chicho explained while touching her belly at the same time she drew a huge belly in the air with her hands. Once the divinity is infected, it is impossible to remove. You will spend every day, every second of your existence giving birth to new beings. That is until all your characteristics are inherited and you are left only as a broken incubator. And not just beyonders. Artifacts after being long exposed to light will start to fail, and after 3 minutes they will break and go back to being characteristics. Giving birth. But that's more on the side of the divine horn, not the overdeveloped bush. Adrian looked stunned at this, then realization shone on his face as he realized a big problem. I refuse to go. Adrian, get me out of here. I refuse to be a human incubator. Flora Jacob, the parasite from sequence 4, a demigod, began to cry from fear of her possible fate if she went there. And Adrian also refused to have baby worms moving inside him. But in this situation, there was nothing he could do about it. Flora isn't able to parasitize me completely at the same time as she can't leave my body. I know Hunter's Hallow acted when she first entered and made her like this. But couldn't that also mean that she unwittingly relies on a bit of its protection as well? The robe has shown to possess a conscience, so they can easily assume that letting Flora get hurt will mean that I will get hurt, so it will protect her. This was a mere theory with almost no foundation. The only way to check it would be on sight. Letting out a slight sigh, Adrian looked seriously at Chicho. That there aren't going to be any demigods would mean that beyonders below sequence 4 can move around there without a problem. How many will I have to deal with once I'm inside? Most of their forces are above, but the cave system is still full of them. In the entire cave system, there are exactly 315 enemies, all varying from normal humans and beyonders from sequence 9 to a single sequence 2 angel. The angel and demigods are all on the far end, so you won't have to worry about them. Last time I checked, a few minutes before I rescued you, I saw 5 go way down the tunnel to the core. I can't see past that without risking infection. Squinting, Adrian clicked his tongue in annoyance at such a number. His mind already jumping to some suspects. Don't worry. I think I know who they are. A foul-smelling dog, an anemic bat murderer, Gasparine's ugly cousin, the Brainiac, and the evil version of Dr. Chaplin. Yep, my current self doesn't stand a chance. I can't hurt the ghost, and a single hit from the bat will knock me out. Not to mention if it possesses me I'm dead again. Not to mention the doctor's ridiculous healing ability, and the Brainiac has a very hard body that will be difficult if not impossible for me to break with my current strength. The neutered dog won't be much of a problem, the headache is those 4. Not to mention there may be more than them. Adrian's mind began to plot every possible move, but they all ended in the same thing. Failure. His current self wouldn't stand a chance. Even if he could take Talk Millennium and hang over time, his chances wouldn't grow much. Again, he was only sequence 7, what could he hope to accomplish being so weak? But if I was sequence 6 I might have a chance to do this. His eyes flashed, a crazy idea forming quickly in him. Yeah, it could work. Chicho said nothing and just tilted her head to the other side somewhat confused, the motion very similar to how a bird would do when it sees something curious. Ignoring his messenger, Adrian walked to the wall. No one can hear us, right? He asked calmly as his fist burst into flames, illuminating the dark cavern and making his scarlet eyes glow. Princess, what stupid thing are you planning to do now? Flora asked accusingly and with enormous suspicion. She knew that tone very well. That was the tone the princess used before doing something crazy. I locked the door. Even if someone walked by they wouldn't see or hear us. Chicho replied curiously. Adrian's smile sharpened as he raised his fist. Excellent. Bang. The wall shattered under the power of the blow and chunks of rock flew everywhere, but before they could go too far they disappeared after crossing a certain point behind the giantess, back. Chicho looked curiously at her contractor, who now carried a particularly sharp rock. What do you plan to do, Lord Adrian? Isn't it obvious? The red-haired man's feral grin grew as he made a long cut on his hand from which warm crimson blood began to drip. I plan to do something incredibly stupid. Flora wasn't even alarmed to see what the redhead did, she quickly understood what he wanted to do. An emergency ritual. I have to make sure there's nothing wrong with us. The redhead replied seriously, this was something that couldn't take any longer than it already had. Chicho looked somewhat confused at the red-haired man. You've been talking to yourself for a while now. Is that a peculiarity of yours, Lord Adrian? So not even an angel with some control over the door pathway can see Flora. Magnificent. Adrian was extremely impressed with Hunter's Hallow's abilities. At the same time his smile only grew bigger as he looked around satisfied. Maybe. If Chicho couldn't see Flora, that meant the doctor couldn't either. His best hidden card was undoubtedly the perverted worm. Shaking his head slightly, Adrian considered whether he should tell his messenger about his little friend living inside him. Talking to Flora right now is necessary, so I won't always be able to act like I'm talking to myself. There's also the fact that Chicho is an angel. She may have already gotten the idea that I'm talking to someone, but because of Hunter's Hallow she can't see my little worm in the apple. Besides, it may be more useful for her to know than for me to try to hide it uselessly. With the decision made, Adrian let out a pleased chuckle and snapped his fingers lightly. Chicho, if I'm talking to myself, don't pay much attention to me. I'm just talking to my very dear imaginary friend Flora. Maybe you can meet her someday, she's all love. The love they were talking about now. If she could, she would have blushed a little, idiot. Chicho's expression didn't change, she kept that somewhat curious look as her eyes shifted slightly from side to side in search of that friend. One eyebrow gently raised in doubt whether what he said was true or not. His foot burst into flames and Adrian gave a light stomp. A soft but strong wave of fire erupted from it and moved all the debris out of the way, freeing up a good space for what the redhead wanted to do. The flames disappeared from his foot and he crouched down. With the blood that fell from his hand he began to draw the tip of a spear on the ground, making sure to fill the tip with red with soft, slow strokes. The scarlet monarch that burns depravity. Ancient Hermes began to sound as his spirituality moved with his hand, accompanying each stroke and charging the blood. Chicho's curious expression changed to one of genuine surprise, which in turn was mixed with curiosity. Adrian ignored his messenger completely and focused all his attention on what he was doing. Although the job was quite simple, the slightest mistake would be fatal. The book of rituals that his teacher had given him taught him a lot about rituals. He was not at Charlotte's level, but his rituals were nothing to be ashamed of. When you don't have all the materials to make a ritual of sacrifice, it is possible to use a single element that represents the entity you want to sacrifice. The element must not be weak and must point precisely to the entity. There is almost no element that fulfills this, but that is why we can transform our blood into a basic altar to the entity. You are the calamity of the old days. This brings certain risks as it becomes an obligation to extend the honorific name to ensure that the one we are sacrificing is the correct one. Of course, this changes if it is a god, since it will not be necessary to add another line. But good luck trying to test this ritual with that. They never respond to a ritual made of just blood. You are the closest to the oldest one. This is one of the most dangerous methods, and only in the most extreme cases can one think of perhaps using it. With my most recent tests, I discovered that the danger can become greater if one is not careful in the amount of blood that is used. Too much blood and you can easily target an evil entity regardless of whether you have used the correct honorific name. Your humble servant prays for your attention. But if performed correctly, this emergency altar can become extremely useful. In my great opinion. Closing square bracket. I pray for more strength. This method is a 4.3 out of 10. I would not recommend it, but they were fun experiments. One would think that with such a low score the best thing to do would be to destroy the information about this method and make the greatest effort to hide it. But I refuse. The more knowledge that is spread around, the better people will be able to protect themselves. I pray that you open the gates to your kingdom, and that I will defend until the day I die. Chapter 216 Blood Altars Introduction to Rituals by Debulg Haiseng. Whispers reached his ears, but Adrian had already begun to draw the sphere of light in his mind. In a few moments, he found himself in front of the magnificent city that reminded him so much of home. His eyes only lingered on it for a few seconds before moving to his side, in search of the familiar flame. There you are. Floating gently a few feet away from him were three flames dancing despite the lack of wind. Two of them were pulsing slightly. Without looking, Adrian held out his hand and from his pile of items floated a familiar golden medal accompanied by 2 containers and a new change of clothes. At this rate, I'll be nothing but a gambling addict. Always defying fate. Reviewing once again what he was going to do, the red-haired man couldn't help but think that he was trying his luck too much. That may be part of my honorific name. I like it. It was time to change the last line of his honorific name and this one sounded pretty good. At the same time as the warm metal fell into his hand, his own appearance changed. Instead of wearing the tight-fitting pants, he was now wearing a long crimson tunic, and rust-stained red armor covered his body. With the appearance of his Scarlet Monarch persona at the ready and with the anti-babies in hand, Adrian stepped forward. The next second he was on top of a yellowish cloud, but instead of his body falling through it he was sitting on top of it. The only thing limiting what he could do here was his imagination. If he wanted to he could become a giant and act like a kaiju stomping around the outskirts of the city. Of course, that would drain him of his spirituality the instant he tried it. He already proved it. Making sure it looked good by adding a bit more glitter along with more smoke to cover his face, he finally extended his hand towards the flames that had been following him. Everything is in order. Using a 3-line honorific name must have been a surprise to Chicho, so part of the plan must have worked. If she really is someone that old, then, even if the likelihood is next to nil, she should know a little about the Sephiroth. Adding that she is from the death pathway, one of the paths adjacent to Hunter and Demon but incompatible with their Sephira, then she should be able to recognize the City of Calamities. Of course, the likelihood of her knowing what the city is so low that she's even completely unaware of what it is. Although her ancestor tried to accommodate the tributary of the River of Eternal Darkness, so again, it wouldn't be too crazy to think that she has an idea of what the Sephiroth are. His hand that was fiddling with the cloud beneath him froze for a second. His eyebrows rose as a revelation hit him. The blank space in his memory suddenly filled up and the red-haired man found himself in complete disbelief. Gritting his teeth, Adrian let out a low sigh followed by an incredulous chuckle. How did I not notice it before? It was in front of me the whole time. Shaking his head, the redhead would think more about this when he was in a safer place. Checking one last time that everything was in order and making the smoke covering his face a little thicker, the redhead let his spirituality spread. I would have preferred a little more brightness, but I have to save my spirituality for this. I can't leave a single detail out. With determination shining in his eyes at the same time, the flame door opened. It was time to fool an angel. Chicho looked down at the kneeling figure of her contractor, her lips raised slightly. This is certainly unexpected. The surprise only lasted a few seconds before she remembered something. Giving a slight chuckle, Chicho shook her head and waited patiently for the red-headed man to finish. Suddenly, the smile on the giantess' face froze as her eyebrows rose to touch her hair at what she was seeing. The blood on the floor began to bubble. The bubbles popped with loud pops that released a large amount of what appeared to be yellow smoke. The next second, the blood ignited into orange flames. These flames swirled in front of the kneeling Adrian and began to rise high, quickly forming a gate of flames. The fire that consisted of the body of the gate began to release more of that yellowish smoke, and after that, an image showed through. A magnificent city covered almost entirely in that same smoke, with pure fire humanoids wearing ancient armor patrolling the streets. And above the city, sitting with his knees crossed and his chin resting on his right palm, was a figure. This one wore red armor covered with a robe of the same color. The same smoke covered his face, making him impossible to see. That figure was releasing an aura of majesty and power, no doubt to crush anyone who confronted him. Impossible, Chicho whispered breathlessly. Her hands began to tremble the same second she saw the city. But quickly she recovered, her expression became serene and her eyes cooled slightly, her eyebrows slightly tightened. By reflex, she lowered her head until her gaze touched the ground, a light layer of sweat forming on her forehead. The yellowish smoke rising from the fire door took on a golden hue and exuded an aura of holiness. This holy smoke moved as if it had life and quickly enveloped Adrian in what could only be described as an embrace. Chicho's jaw trembled slightly and her eyes glistened for an instant. After about 15 seconds of embracing Adrian's body, the golden smoke receded into the door, which closed, leaving behind 4 objects that were not there before. Opening his eyes, Adrian let out a soft sigh as he straightened up and made a military salute with reverence. Praise the Scarlet Monarch. Praise the Scarlet Monarch. Flora repeated vehemently but showed her respect for the god. Her voice quieter as already knowing that the red-haired man would still go to war, she took advantage and not only asked for cleansing but protection against whatever was there. Without turning around, Adrian simply grabbed the button of his pants. Could you turn around? Without waiting for an answer from his messenger, the red-haired man shamelessly pulled down his pants. There was a slight bounce in the unmistakable sound of flesh hitting flesh and Adrian couldn't help but sigh with relief. Those pants felt like they wanted to cut off Junior's circulation. Chicho had already turned around, her back to the redhead and her expression unreadable. Imperceptibly, her black eyebrows were quivering. I'd slap you if I could. Flora murmured in complete resignation as she sank into her depression at what the redhead had just done. Who gets naked in front of a very possible angel? Letting out a chuckle as he buckled into a much more comfortable and of his trouser style, the redhead's eyes narrowed slightly. Yeah, I bet you'd like to show me my place, wouldn't you? Adrian whispered, slurring the words as he licked his lips, his voice sweet and thick as honey. His hands moved down from his chest to his waist in a sensual and provocative glide. Adria Princess TTU. Now is not the time for this. Flora, extremely embarrassed, complained in a high-pitched voice. No matter if he whispered, she doubted that the angel hadn't heard that. I know, but I'm just mentally preparing myself for this. He may not have said anything, but the depth in his gaze was noticed by her favorite parasite. Eyeing him suspiciously, the Jacob's attention moved to the containers that came out along with the clothes and the oddly named artifact. Immediately recognizing them, Flora shivered slightly and she felt her non-existent lips go dry. The likelihood of you surviving is too slim, you know that, don't you? Pulling his black jacket over himself and finishing adjusting the emergency tools he had, Adrian nodded. If I want to stand a chance against them, I need to be stronger. Sitting down on the ground and crossing his knees, he grabbed the containers and placed them on top of his lap. Undoing the wall of spirituality that covered them, he opened the containers. One jar was filled with a green liquid and a purple brain with lumps and throbbing black veins floating in it. In the other was a large purple eye with a bright red iris and whose sharp pupil was ghostly white. This eye still had the nerve hanging out like a tail. The Sphinx's brain and the black hunting spider's composite eye respectively. These were the main ingredients of the conspirator potion. What is my exact chance of survival if I consume the main ingredients raw? Raising his voice, Adrian asked the older and more experienced people in the room. I don't recommend it, Lord Adrian. Shaking her head gently, Chicho spoke in a calm voice. Consuming the raw characteristics would be equal to consuming the most potent poison one can imagine. Those are the ingredients coming directly from the creatures, so it will be worse. Most likely your body will break down before you even have time to lose control. She is right, Princess. Flora showed her acceptance of the angel's response, but she wanted to make sure the redhead understood, so she deepened that. If they came from a Beander, at most you would only have to worry about overcoming consuming an extra 9 to 6 potions as well as dominating the residue of the Beander's will without the supplemental ingredients to suppress it. In other words, you would not only be fighting against the Beander's will but against what would be equal to consuming a minimum of 4 extra potions. Consuming the raw ingredients is nothing better, it would even be worse. While coming from the creatures directly, you would only have to worry about their will and no extra potion. The effect they will have on your body is worse. Being characteristics, the effect they will have on your mind is extremely reduced by having gone through a Beander before. But the raw ingredients do not. Many main ingredients are shared between pathways that are adjacent to each other. Being raw ingredients, supplemental ingredients also serve to suppress any other effects they might have that are not from your path. My family did many tests throughout history. Many of the experiments and their results were lost, but of those that survived, the descendants, we can be sure. Consuming ingredients that have not gone through a Beander as a way to advance is worse than consuming the raw characteristics. If you consume them, your chance of survival will be 1 in a million, Flora explained in a deep, serious voice. At no point did she pause, and she spoke at all times clearly. Adrian listened to the explanations with a serene expression, his eyes never moving from the brain and eye. So, the most likely thing to happen if I consume this is that my body will break down first before I lose control. Did you even listen to anything I told you? Motherfucker. Quote. I'm sure. Ads by PubFuture. Nodding at the women's responses and ignoring the ringing in his ear, Adrian felt that his plan might work. So that would mean that if my body could be repaired at the same rate it breaks, it could work. Flora's furious screams came to a screeching halt, and a huge silence filled the room. Realization hit her and she immediately realized what the redhead wanted to do. Adrian, you're not thinking about that, are you? After hearing her contractor's question, Chicho frowned slightly, but after a few seconds, she replied in a calm voice. Quote, If that were the case and you could bear the mental burden of consuming the ingredients without losing control, then yes. Adrian's lips turned up in a predatory smile, like that of a dragon ready to devour the sheep. That's all I wanted to hear. Quickly, Adrian uncapped the jar containing the Sphinx's brain. He placed it in the same container as the eye, and crushed them with his bare hands. He began to make a pulp of those foul ingredients. The pulp now had a blackish-purple color and was releasing a vomit-green liquid. Adrian looked at his hands and he whistled, somewhat surprised. There was no trace of the ingredients left between his fingers or fingernails. Well, here goes nothing. Raising his right hand, he placed it on his chest, his heart beating calmly despite what was coming. But before doing so, the redhead let out a slight sigh. I made a promise that I wouldn't do this. And I never would if we weren't in this situation, but things happen that are out of our control that make us break promises and hurt the people we care about. I just hope she can forgive me for this and not get too angry. Quote, I'm sure whoever she promised that to would understand the situation. Chicho consoled horribly and the redhead couldn't help but let out a slight chuckle. You're not very good at this, you know. Flora on her side looked speechless at her partner, unable to give words to what she was feeling. She just wanted to lock herself in her room in her mansion and cry, but she also wanted to laugh like a fool at the comedy of romance she saw so much in the theaters when she was still in her 20s. Is this idiot seriously thinking about a promise like that right now? Why did he just now have to care about how I feel? You're seriously a bastard, Adrian Kenway. Despite what she wanted to say, the demi-goddess couldn't help but feel good that he at least remembered what she said. She felt really good. So, swallowing her chagrin and emotions, Flora snorted with a little more emotion than she wanted to. You better make this up to me. Adrian smiled, but, unlike the previous times, this was a very gentle smile, and nodded. Looking over his shoulder at Chicho, who was looking at him curiously, his gentle smile turned into a grin. Listen, Chicho, if we are going to do this, we will do it my way, you understand? His voice left no room for a denial and Chicho knew it. She knew that if she refused, the man would do nothing. She had seen those eyes before, there was no room for negotiation here. And what would be your plan then, Mr. Adrian? It's simple. We will do everything you said until the end. Quote. After a long pause of 5 seconds and in front of the flat look of his messenger, Adrian continued with a sideways smile, adding more things of course. Quote. I don't even know why I'm trying anymore. You have no salvation. Flora was completely resigned to the fact that the redhead would never not provoke someone no matter how powerful or important they were. Quote. What do you have in mind, Mr. Adrian? After a long pause of her own, Chicho asked, voice gentle and soft as always, but hidden within that softness was a tiny hint of annoyance. Being a provoker, the red-haired man detected that hint as if it were a shark sniffing a drop of blood in the rough sea. That made his slight smile turn into a full one, but knowing when it was time to stop, he decided to stop with the teasing. So, with a tone that did not hide his amusement at all, he explained the improved plan. As soon as I teleport out, I want you to completely seal the tunnel and the core site, no one can get out or in. I also want you to make sure the angel and those demigods stay behind playing tea house. Even if in theory they can't get close, the emptiness they have for brains and the madness of following that malformed bush won't make them hesitate to go protect the core. Quote. That won't be a problem. Keeping her face calm and with a voice that could no longer show annoyance, the phoenix accepted her share of the pie. Her eyes were slightly wider in slight surprise. Quote. In fact, I can't believe I'm saying this, but that's a much better plan than your messengers, princess. Flora half-grudgingly admitted, she hadn't considered the madness of the Rose School of Thought members. Giving a toothy smile, Adrian gave a satisfied nod, his hand still resting on his chest. Good little birdie. By the way, Chicho, don't freak out about this. Freak out about what? Plush. Crack. Thus, looking into the confused eyes of his messenger and with his classic smile on his face, the red-haired man plunged his own hand into his chest and crushed his heart. Quote exclamation mark quote. With blood dripping from his mouth and ignoring the slight discomfort in his chest, Adrian gave a mocking laugh at the giantess, incredulous expression. Don't worry, I can revive. I'll be back in a little while. After saying that, his eyes closed and the red-haired man fell on his side with a thud, dead. Chicho looked at this with her mouth half open, unable to find words for what had just happened. It may be suicidal, but I can see the joy in upsetting an angel. Flora thought to herself, not having enough courage to say it out loud for fear of provoking Her Excellency. She wasn't that crazy. Underneath a recently abandoned factory on Cuss Street. Red candles were burning, their soft yellow flames causing huge shadows in the dark room, shadows that seemed to be moving as if they had life. They watched everything that was happening with eyes hidden behind their curtain of shadows. Ah! A faint moan sounded in the shaded room. The shadows seemed to laugh at the pain that the person kneeling in the circle of candles that in turn were raised on an altar was going through. This person had the appearance of a handsome man, with black curls covering his back and somewhat delicate eyebrows. He wore a long black tunic that covered his whole body and whose hood was down. Mr. M of the Aurora Order, one of the 22 oracles. And lying on the altar in front of him, without a shirt showing how there was a human face on his chest that by the closed eyes seemed to be asleep, was Lenevis. The swindler's expression was one of pure pain, but barely a whimper came out of his mouth. He could not move and could only watch in despair as the face on his chest slowly moved upwards towards his own. Lenevis knew it was only a matter of time before he died, but no matter how much he wanted to, he could do nothing to fight that fate. I don't want to die, I don't want to die. Bitter tears fell from his eyes along with another painful whimper as the face on his chest moved higher. He tried to think of any way to escape, anything, however small. But there was no way out. Not only could he not move, but he could feel the control of his body getting smaller and smaller. The closer that face got to his, the more it felt like he was not himself. Another pathetic whimper came out of his mouth. The clear tears on his face turned to red and Lenevis watched in terror as shadows began to cover his legs as ravings began to rage furiously in his mind. No. He could feel his sanity slipping away and what little control he had over his body was taken from him. The falling tears dried up, and the horrified expression became a flat one but with the corners of his lips raised slightly. The only thing that showed that the swindler was still there was the enormous emotion in his eyes that in an empty expression stood out like a lighthouse on the coast on a night without stars or moon. Now Lenevis could only watch everything in horror, trapped inside his own body. He had a mouth and a voice. But despite that, he couldn't. He had a mouth and he couldn't scream. Mr. M looked at this and let out an exclamation of delight. A huge smile on his face as he bowed his head to the ground in extreme reverence. That was much better than being boiled to death. Letting out an internal sigh, the red-haired man felt strangely happy with himself. After all, the last 2 times he died were quite painful. I think my tolerance broke a little, I barely felt it when I burst my heart. Shaking his head, Adrian finally opened his eyes and could see the familiar emptiness that seemed to be turning into his recreational room. Squinting, he remained still and did not move at all. Something's wrong. The limbo he was in now felt different. It looked and felt the same, but he could also sense that something had changed. Something that shouldn't be. Looking around with slow and careful movements, Adrian felt the discomfort in his stomach grow. The discomfort only continued to grow little by little, as if something was closing in on him. The redhead felt that right now, and unlike the previous 2 times he was here, he was not alone. Quickly realizing the danger he was in, Adrian let his instinct guide him as he started swimming fast toward where he felt his body was. I have to get out of here and fast. His spirituality flared and the red-haired man reflexively swam to the side. A horrible chill ran through his soul and he gritted his teeth. Despite not having made any noise or being seen, the red-haired man was sure. Something tried to attack me. Sending discretion to hell, he accelerated with all his might. He tried to summon his fire control, but no matter how deep he looked, nothing was answering him. In this emptiness, he was a normal person. His soul's painful protest was ignored as he gave another Naden to the side. Again. And he was sure it was not the same one. In the distance, he saw the familiar flash and the red-haired man felt extremely relieved. The exit had been found. But the next instant he almost froze, and just kept swimming on instinct. With the new source of light, he could now see in this emptiness. And what he was seeing only made him force his soul to move even faster through this darkness. Rapidly ascending from the deepest part of the abyss and surrounding him from almost all sides, an infinite number of beings of pure darkness extended their dark appendages upwards. And that mass of darkness that only seemed to grow larger and larger was rapidly approaching him. Shit. Adrian was sure that whatever attacked him earlier must have been one of these things of darkness. He felt it. As soon as he could see them, he felt it. One of those things would touch him and he could kiss his resurrection goodbye. He would definitely be dead. Fuck shit fucking swim. Roaring all sorts of insults in his mind at the same time he felt his soul could barely hold itself together. Adrian gave his all to get to his body whose light was getting bigger. He could already see his new hole in the chest of his body, just a little more and he would get there. From the mass of darkness that now seemed more like a gateway to the abyss, 3 slender beings of darkness shot out. Their movements were like those of a fish in water and they were rapidly approaching him. Gritting his teeth, Adrian quickly made a sideways swim, barely dodging the surprise onslaught. His soul protested again at the brusque movement but was ignored with great effort. The beings of darkness stood still after being dodged as if they didn't know what to do now that their attack had failed, but this only lasted an instant as the next moment they lashed out again at the red-haired man. Ads by PubFuture. This wasn't the party I meant. Cursing his big mouth, Adrian accelerated his swim, barely dodging another lash. Again the same thing happened as before, those things stayed still as they were dodged. Giving precious seconds to the red-haired man who, even though he was confused by the way those things acted, would not waste them. He reached out his hand, his body almost within reach. The beings of darkness, regaining control of themselves, rushed towards him. The distance between them and Adrian was that of a breath. His soul begged him to stop, to rest, that he could not take any more. But the red-haired man didn't care, so with a last whip of his legs and the claws of those monsters millimeters away from touching him, he stretched out his fingers as far as possible, but it wasn't enough. Just before he could be touched, the darkness around his body came to life, and with a powerful whip, it pushed the creatures away from him and after doing so formed a circle of darkness enclosing Adrian along with his body. Recognition shone in his eyes and he grinned from ear to ear. Hunter's Hallow. The red-haired man had never been so happy to see his robe. The precious seconds he needed were his. Finally, surrounded by the abyss itself and having swum what he swore was a marathon. Adrian's hand made contact with his body. A huge light was born from where he touched his body, purging the monsters and painting the darkness white. Adrian felt his sanity slipping away, the pain of now. No, the agony. It was. As his mind slipped further and further out of reach. Far away, far beyond what his demolished, tortured mind could bear. A huge number of voices were speaking, nowhere was there the harmony of the first time. Where once all the voices were saying the same thing at the same time, in one great and somewhat overwhelming chant, now there was only chaos and disorder. Horrendous screams of anger. A myriad of voices were speaking, none at the same time, and each and every one of them was saying a different thing. To the redhead's delicate mind, at this exact moment, he felt he was seriously going to lose control. The only thing that kept him anchored was his tolerance for these horrible raps thanks to the true creator and the burnt Bambi. Squeezing as tightly as he could be squeezed, Adrian focused all his attention on the white light. The voices were getting louder, now screaming with full fury sounding more like apocalypse drums than voices. The red-haired man could feel himself slipping but clinging to his sanity, he stayed anchored. When the light reached its highest point and consequently the voices, Adrian could feel the voices suddenly go quiet. Before he could rejoice at that a single voice cried out, a single voice that completely eclipsed the previous ones. For the power it brought behind it, it was by far the loudest as well. # not ###. This time, Adrian could recognize what it said but not understand it. The meaning, he felt, was on the tip of his tongue but at the same time it was far, far, far away. Without knowing why, An enormous sadness choked him at the same time that a great sense of fulfillment enveloped him. The emotional pain was such that it even eclipsed the spiritual pain he felt. Before he could make sense of what was happening, it was all over. Right now Chicho was sitting on her knees, her back slightly hunched as her gaze was completely focused on the recently dead man in front of her. Any minuscule change, whether it was the way the blood was pouring out of his body from the hole in his chest, the way the new clothes were stained with the same, or how the red-haired man's smile didn't diminish for a moment. The attention with which she's looking at him would make any dance teacher proud. Yes, even you, Professor Jennifer. Damn bitch. Flora felt a little uncomfortable even though she wasn't the target of that look that brought back bad memories of her childhood. Adrian, please hurry up. I never thought being looked at by an angel would be so uncomfortable. As if answering her prayers, her Prince Charming arrived. Sitting up suddenly while taking a huge breath of air, Adrian had come back to life. Although his vision was a little blurry and he was still a little groggy from what he had heard, Adrian didn't waste a second. With the large hole in his chest closing rapidly, he quickly grabbed the pulp he had made earlier. Not even bothered by the strong smell of ammonia from it, Adrian opened his mouth as wide as he could and gulp. With a loud gulp, Adrian consumed most of the pulp, and ignoring the bad aftertaste it left, he quickly ate the leftovers that escaped him. As soon as he had done that, he immediately tried to go into cogitation in preparation for what was to come. Huff huff. It didn't take 3 seconds for it all to begin. All the air left his lungs and Adrian had to stop his fall by placing his hand on the ground. Powerful illusory ravings reached his ears and assaulted his mind, but they were so weak to what he was already used to that he just ignored them as if they were an annoying puppy. A small whimper came out of his mouth and Adrian watched the changes that were quickly appearing on his hands. The smooth pale skin was quickly covered with thin black hairs that were getting longer and longer, making it look like he was wearing gauntlets of hair. His muscles bulged out of shape, tearing the shirt he was wearing and almost tearing his jacket as well. The fur was torn, followed by the skin, and large amounts of blood suddenly began to gush out of it, releasing steam all over those wounded nerves due to the warmth of the blood. His veins suddenly became visible all over his body, throbbing exaggeratedly and a horrible black color. The whites of his eyes were suddenly covered with red veins about to explode, red blood pouring from them. Teeth sharpened and grew with ridiculous speed, piercing even the cheeks. His now claws sank into the rock, easily slicing through it, and the red-haired man coughed out a red, fleshy lump. His body was breaking and Adrian knew it. What Chicho said would happen was happening. But he could feel it too, how he was advancing. Slowly, information was coming into his brain and he could feel his spirituality and his power growing. Ha ha ha, ah ha 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 ha. Adrian laughed madly, a horrible sharp-toothed grin on his face. His eyes moved to the hole where his heart was and he saw how the heart was already completely regenerated and the hole was already closing. The smile on his face froze and he let out another growl, only this one more bestial and guttural, not at all like the sound a human would make. His sight moved to the cracks and mutations in his body and he watched in annoyance as regeneration was overtaking them. The huge cracks in his hands began to close faster than they were breaking. The hair covering his skin was falling out rapidly. His spirituality stopped growing and he was shrinking again. The new information coming into his brain stopped as well. The plan was working too well. Regeneration was not only healing him but it was trying to expel what was harming him from his body. The regeneration was trying to expel the ingredients from his body. No, I need more time. He still hadn't advanced, there was still more to go. Without wasting a single second, Adrian raised a sharp claw and pierced his stomach. His organs were scattered on the ground but they were barely out for a second before they came back in. Not wanting to risk his promotion and not wanting to kill himself again, for he knew that if he died again he would not be able to escape these things, Adrian went for the nuke. Raising both claws this time, he went through his stomach again, only this time he didn't pull out his organs. His crazed spirituality glowed and he lit his insides on fire. Ahahahahaha, that burns, Adrian laughed as he made the flames as hot as he could. He could feel his stomach, intestines, kidneys, lungs and newly regenerated heart were being cooked. But his attention was on his arms and how they swelled back up and the skin was breaking again along with the fur growing back. His toothy grin was back in full force as new information came back into his brain and his spirituality was growing again. Cough. Another lump of flesh came out of his mouth, only this one was burned. The pain was horrible, but it was nothing he hadn't already gone through and overcome by far. So as soon as he coughed up that lump of flesh, he returned all his attention to cogitation. Several times the ball of light was drawn in his foggy mind, over and over again as he kept his insides burning. A balance that was so delicate that it would break with the slightest distraction. This was something Chicho and Flora knew, so neither said or did anything. Chicho looked with serious eyes at her contractor while Flora felt like she was going to die from worry, her insides twisting and only being able to watch as her partner danced on the fine line to the abyss. Huff 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 huff. ... To Adrian it seemed that this should have lasted longer, but the new information and his new spirituality told him that it was all over. Slowly, he opened his eyes and saw his hands that were covered in warm blood but were those of a human. He had made it. He was now a Sequence 6 conspirator. Reviewing the new information of what he could now do, eyebrows much more delicate than before rose slightly. That's something unexpected. His voice was now much more sensual, with a softness and texture such that it chilled the skin. Princess. His worm's extremely concerned voice rang in his mind and the redhead gave a soft smile. The one and only Miss Worm. A small sigh of relief sounded in his mind, followed by a question, are you going to turn that off or what? It's giving me a thing to watch it heal only to be destroyed. He could feel his insides still burning. The pain of it didn't bother him one bit. If he was the same as before he would have already put out those flames. But he wasn't anymore. He felt not like him. This should alarm him, but strangely enough, he didn't care at all. But not because he didn't care at all he would put it aside, but because of that, he had to relive it with more urgency even if he didn't feel it. When I finish this I have to see what's wrong with me. Noting this down to check later, he smiled softly again and shook his head. Hoo, don't worry. I'll need that if I want to have a chance. Talk Millennium that was still on the ground suddenly rose, as if being lifted by invisible threads to the open palm of the red-haired man who looked at this calmly. Grasping the artifact of the sun pathway, Adrian opened his mouth. Gulp. What the fuck Adryan? What's wrong with you? Flora shouted in disbelief. He had swallowed the artifact. Chicho said that any artifact that is out in the open will break in 3 minutes, Adrian commented casually as he wiped his lips with his sleeve. Talk Millennium is an artifact that I don't need to touch to use. Being inside me will ensure that nothing is going to happen to it and I don't have to worry about the 3 minutes. Same for you, Flora. Being inside me, nothing is going to happen to you. Quote. What the fuck happened to you, Adrian? After a few seconds Flora asked, her voice stiff and groggy. Adrian lowered his gaze to his hands, which were quickly covered in golden fire. With the new body of Sequence 6, these flames no longer hurt him. Quote. I don't know. Scarlet eyes that now glowed like flames moved to his messenger. Chicho had a blank expression on her face, her eyes showed nothing and she was looking at him as if she couldn't recognize him. I'm ready. The messenger said nothing, just gave a rough nod as she raised her hand. In front of Adrian a door of white light formed, showing the corridor with the cages. Without another glance at his messenger or another word, he took a step and entered. The door then disappeared and Chicho stared for a few seconds at the place where her contractor once stood. That's not good. Not good at all. The Phoenix muttered before sighing, and she too stepped through her own door. She still had a duty to perform.